Yo, Atlas speaking, and welcome to part 8 of What If I Was Reborn into the world of Avatar as the Prince Zuko and took over the world. Let the tale begin. Skip chapter 61 because of explicit scenes. Chapter 62, Port Arrival. The wind, thick with the scent of salt and the fainter, earthier promise of land, whipped at the edges of Zuko's heavy crimson cloak. He stood at the bow of the warship, his gaze fixed on the emerging silhouette of the Earth Kingdom coast. It was a rugged shoreline, softened by the gathering haze of a late afternoon sun struggling to break through low-hanging clouds. The ship cut through the choppy waters with the steady, relentless rhythm of a heartbeat, each surge and dip a physical reminder of the journey's end. Beneath his ornate boots, the deck vibrated, a comforting thrum that had become the backdrop to his recent, turbulent existence. His right shoulder, still heavily bandaged beneath his tunic, throbbed with a persistent ache, a souvenir from General Fawn's last, desperate strike. Every shift of his weight, every slight adjustment of his stance against the ship's sway, sent a dull tremor through his form. The victory at Nanhai, for all its glory and the legend it had spun around his name, had exacted a price. Yet, he held himself rigid, a defiant pillar against the elements, refusing to yield to the pain. He was Prince Zuko, victor of Nanhai, and he would carry the scars of that triumph with a grim pride. Behind him, Azula leaned against a rail, her arms crossed, her eyes, sharp and predatory, taking in every detail of the coastline, every minute twitch of Zuko's jaw. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk played on her lips, a silent commentary on his chosen solitude at the prow. She knew him too well, or perhaps, she believed she did. His secrets, those whispered conversations with the head sage, the spectral encounter with Roku, the troubling visions of a stranger. These were fortresses within his mind that her spies reported to her. The very secrets he guarded with a ferocity that surprised even her. The twisted intimacy they now shared, a heavy blanket of their shared darkness, only made him guard them more fiercely. He had given her his body, but his soul, his true purpose, remained inviolable. Rin and Ensign Lee stood a respectful distance away, their forms solid and watchful. Rin, ever the pragmatist, had adjusted his stance to the ship's roll with practiced ease, his hand resting almost unconsciously on the hilt of his dao. Lee, younger but no less devoted, mirrored Rin's vigilance, his gaze sweeping the horizon, then returning to Zuko, a silent vow of protection in his posture. They were his shadow, his shield, and in Rin's case, his cautious conscience. As the ship drew closer, the details of the port began to sharpen. It was a substantial harbor, nestled in a wide bay, protected by a natural rock formation on one side and a man-made sea wall on the other. Fire Nation banners, emblazoned with the stylized flame, fluttered from every mast and prominent building, stark red against the muted greens and grays of the Earth Kingdom architecture. Smoke plumed from several chimneys, hinting at industrial activity, probably Fire Nation foundries repurposed for their war effort. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of brine, coal smoke, and the distant, earthy smell of the land. The harbor was a hive of activity. Smaller Fire Nation patrol boats zipped across the water, making way for the imposing warship. Cranes loomed over docks, their long arms laden with cargo nets. Figures bustled about, a mix of Fire Nation soldiers in their standard-issue armor and Earth Kingdom citizens, their drab clothing a stark contrast to the vivid red. From this distance, Zuko could already feel the tension in the air, a crackling undercurrent beneath the mundane sounds of commerce and military operations. The ship's horn boomed, a deep, resonant cry that echoed across the bay, announcing their arrival. Mooring lines were prepared, and the great vessel began its slow, majestic turn towards a designated berth. The sounds of the port intensified, shouted orders, the creak of wood, the clang of metal, the distant shouts of merchants. As the ship nudged against the sturdy wooden pier, a contingent of Fire Nation soldiers, led by a portly, grim-faced commander, snapped to attention. Zuko waited until the gangplank was securely lowered, a plank of solid oak spanning the divide between the warship and the conquered land. He took a steadying breath, his chest aching slightly, and began his descent. His limp was pronounced now, each step a deliberate effort. He felt the pull of the old injury in his leg, a phantom pain mirroring the very real one in his shoulder. But he kept his head high, his spine straight, his amber eyes fixed forward, betraying none of his discomfort. He was a symbol, a beacon of Fire Nation might, and he would carry that burden with unyielding resolve. As his boot touched the solid wood of the pier, a hush fell over the immediate area. The bustling activities seemed to momentarily pause, as if the very air held its breath. Then, a low murmur began to spread, a ripple effect through the crowd. Soldiers, who had been going about their duties, snapped to a crisp, unified salute, their gazes a mix of awe and something more guarded, almost wary. Civilians, both Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation, stopped to stare. Their faces were a tableau of emotions, curiosity, fear, resentment, and a chilling, almost reverent fascination. Whispers, like the rustling of dry leaves, followed him. The Dragon of Nanhai. Prince Zuko. He killed Fong. Rin and Li stepped onto the pier an instant behind him, forming a tight, protective cordon. Rin's hand remained on his dhow, his eyes scanning the crowd with an expression of hardened vigilance. Li's younger face was set, his gaze firm. Azula disembarked next, her silk uniform catching the light. She walked with a languid grace, her calculated smirk now a fixed mask. She didn't bother with acknowledging the salutes, her intense gaze sweeping over the port, analyzing, dissecting, and most likely, filing away every perceived weakness. She positioned herself a few paces behind Zuko, a silent, deadly shadow. The port commander, a man whose uniform, though impeccably pressed, seemed to strain at the seams, marched forward, his face a mixture of surprise and obsequious deference. "Prince Zuko," he boomed, his voice a little too loud in the sudden quiet. He snapped to attention, his salute precise. "Commander Rakuto, at your service, Your Highness. We were not expecting your arrival so soon. A truly fortuitous surprise." Zuko's voice, though firm, held a gravelly edge from the dust and strain of the journey. "Commander Rakuto. My apologies for the lack of notice. Time is a luxury we cannot afford. The Fire Nation does not wait for its enemies to make the first move." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air, a subtle assertion of his new, unassailable authority. "We require immediate provisions. Maps of the surrounding territories. Detailed intelligence on local villages, troop movements, and any resistance activities. And most importantly, fresh mounts and supplies sufficient for a prolonged march inland." Rakuto stammered, his eyes wide. "A march, Your Highness? So soon? But we had prepared your personal quarters, the finest in the garrison, for your rest and recovery after your glorious victory at Nanhai. The supply lines, they must be assessed, the routes secured." "Within a day, Commander," Zuko cut him off, his voice sharper now, leaving no room for argument. "We depart tomorrow morning. I require everything to be ready by dawn." Rakuto's jaw worked, but he simply bowed. "As you command, Your Highness. It will be done. I will personally oversee the preparations." He turned, barking orders at his subordinates, who scurried away with a newfound urgency. As Rakuto retreated, Rin subtly moved closer to Zuko, lowering his voice. "Prince Zuko, this is too fast. We don't know this terrain. The Earth Kingdom is vast and unforgiving away from the coast. We should take time to scout, to understand the local dynamics. Nanhai was different, it was a confined battleground. Here, we could be walking into any number of ambushes." His concern was genuine, a blend of loyalty and hard-won military experience. Zuko turned his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "We don't have time, Rin. The Avatar is moving. He has APA, he is not constrained by ships and ports. While we assess and scout, he flies. He heads north, towards the air temples, I believe. We must anticipate him, intercept him before he gains whatever advantage he seeks there. Every moment wasted here is a moment he gains on us." His voice was low, meant only for Rin, but the intensity in his eyes spoke volumes. It was a conviction born of more than just strategic planning, it was a knowledge gleaned from the spirit world. Azula, who had been observing the exchange with a detached amusement, purred, "Ah, the Avatar. Always the Avatar. And the sages, of course." She stepped forward, her voice a silken ribbon, dripping with mock concern. "Such an obsession, brother. One might think you're more interested in ancient spirits and forgotten prophecies than solid military conquest." She stopped just beside him, her presence unnervingly close, her gaze flicking from his face to the crowd, then back. "Care to share what the wise old man on Crescent Island whispered into your princely ear? Or perhaps what the Avatar himself told you in your dreams?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle challenge in their depths. "You're hiding something, Zuko. You always are. But this feels different. More urgent. More desperate." Zuko met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He offered her a sliver of truth, carefully chosen. "The sages merely confirmed what any astute military mind would deduce, Azula. The Avatar will seek to reconnect with his heritage, to learn from it. The Northern Air Temple is a logical destination. It is far from the coast, difficult to reach. If we do not move quickly, we will lose him in the vastness of this kingdom." He paused, allowing a calculated weariness to enter his voice. "My desperation, as you call it, is merely a reflection of my duty to the Fire Lord. To end this war. To capture the Avatar." He offered nothing more, his eyes daring her to pry further. He saw the flicker of annoyance in her eyes, the familiar hunger for control, for information, but she let it pass, for now. She always did. "Of course," she said, her voice dry, a hint of disdain. "Duty. Always so noble, Zuko. Let's hope your noble path doesn't lead us into a quagmire." She turned, her attention already drifting to the bustling port, her mind undoubtedly calculating the logistics, the dangers, the strategic opportunities of their rapid inland march. The commander, having organized a procession of soldiers to lead them through the crowded thoroughfares, returned, bowing deep. "Your Highness, your quarters have been prepared. A secure guest house overlooking the harbor. May I escort you?" Zuko merely nodded, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The tension in the air was palpable, the fear and resentment of the occupied, the suspicion and ambition of the occupiers, all simmering beneath a veneer of order. He could feel the weight of it, the complex tapestry of Fire Nation doctrine and Earth Kingdom suffering. He adjusted his stance, wincing subtly at the renewed ache in his shoulder, and followed Rakuto, Rin, and Lee flanking him, Azula a few paces behind. The whispers in the crowd rose again, following them like a spectral tide. Hours later, as dusk deepened, painting the sky in fiery oranges and bruised purples, Zuko stood on a wide, wrought iron balcony of the guest house. Below, the port was transformed. Torches and lanterns cast flickering pools of light across the docks, illuminating the frantic activity of soldiers and laborers preparing for their imminent departure. The air was cooler now, carrying the sharper scent of the sea and the metallic tang of military readiness. From this vantage point, he could see the last sliver of the sun dipping below the distant horizon of the western sea, a final farewell to the vast, open waters. He looked inland, towards the colossal, shadowed form of the Earth Kingdom mainland. A narrow, unpaved road, barely visible in the deepening gloom, snaked away from the port, disappearing into the dark, forested hills. It was a daunting path, leading into the heart of enemy territory, away from the familiar comfort of the Fire Nation's maritime dominance. This was the true challenge, the next phase of his intricate, dangerous game. The Avatar, Roku, Raya, Yogan, all those names and visions swirled in his mind, a potent brew compelling him forward. Rin and Lee joined him on the balcony, their presence a quiet comfort in the echoing vastness of the evening. Rin handed him a steaming cup of jasmine tea, its warmth seeping into his chilled hands. Zuko took a long breath, the tea's floral aroma a momentary reprieve from the sense of war. He gazed out at the two immense forces stretching before him, the boundless sea, a symbol of their past journey and his Fire Nation heritage, and the dark, unending expanse of the land, the unconquered realm of his future. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper against the rising night wind, we march. The Earth Kingdom will remember this path as the road of the Fire Nation Prince. The words hung in the cool evening air, a declaration, a promise, a grim prophecy whispered into the vast, indifferent darkness. Chapter 63, National Level Scandal. The dense Earth Kingdom forest was a tunnel of cicada song, a ceaseless hum that vibrated through the humid air. Overhead, the canopy was a thick, verdant ceiling, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the dirt path below. Zuko's company moved in a quiet, disciplined column, the only sounds their weary footsteps, the rustling of leaves under tread, and the occasional creak of pack mules burdened with their supplies. They had disembarked at a small, unassuming port a week prior and had been marching inland ever since, pushing deeper into the enemy territory. At the head of the column, Zuko and Azula walked in an almost synchronized silence. Their faces were impassive, unreadable stone, offering no hint of the tumultuous waters that churned beneath their composed exteriors. Behind them, Sergeant Rin stomped along, his heavy boots kicking up dust, his eyes perpetually scanning the tree-line. Beside him, Ensign Lee moved with a lighter, more precise step, his gaze often fixed on the ground, as if contemplating the very earth beneath his feet. The silence between the two men was a fragile thing, stretched taut by unspoken thoughts. Rin's mind was a tangled knot of suspicion, festering since the night he'd overheard sounds from the prince's quarters on Crescent Island. He tried to dismiss it, to bury it under the weight of duty, but it clung to him like the oppressive humidity. "This is an emperor's folly, this march," Rin grumbled, breaking the quiet. He didn't look at Lee, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "No scouts. No advanced patrols. Just walking straight into the heart of their goddamn territory." Lee adjusted the strap of his pack. "The Crown Prince's strategy dictates a rapid, direct advance. To slow for extensive scouting would compromise his projected timetable for reaching the Northern Air Temple." "His projected timetable is taking us through a blind alley," Rin retorted, finally glancing at Lee, his eyes narrowed. "And his strategies, they've been getting stranger, haven't they? Since Nanhai. Since that business on Crescent Island." Lee's expression remained neutral. "The prince sustained a grievous injury at Nanhai, Sergeant. It is natural for a period of readjustment. And his council with the fire sages was a matter of spiritual significance." Rin snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Spiritual significance. Is that what we're calling it now? Because last I checked, the fire sages weren't known for brokering private audiences between the Crown Prince and his sister in the dead of the night." Lee stopped, causing Rin to halt abruptly beside him. The other soldiers continued to march on, creating a small, temporary space between them and the main body. Lee's voice, though still calm, held an edge of something akin to reprimand. "Sergeant, you leap to conclusions based on auditory impressions in the dead of night. The Crown Prince is entitled to companionship. To infer further, to accuse him of incest, is a weighty assumption, and frankly, treasonous." Rin's face darkened, a flush rising from his neck. "Treasonous? I know what I heard, Lee. Those weren't the sounds of concubines or handmaidens. That was him and his sister. The damn princess herself. I heard her. Clear as a summer sky." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You heard it too. Don't lie to me. You were there. We were there together." Lee's gaze flickered, a momentary tremor in his usual composure. "Yes, we were there. But the sounds of a dwelling are often distorted in the quiet hours. It could have been any number of women. Or perhaps the prince was indulging himself with his attendants again. A common practice for one of his rank." "Indulging himself?" Rin scoffed, running a hand through his short, bristly hair. "With Princess Azula's voice? Don't try to polish it up with your fancy words, Ensign. We both know what we heard. That wasn't just indulgence, that was fucking. And it was them." They resumed their march, the argument simmering with each step. "And if it was?" Lee said, his voice lower now, almost a murmur against the cicadas. "What does it mean, Sergeant. What purpose does it serve to dwell on such a thing? Purpose? Rin threw his hands up, then quickly lowered them, remembering their proximity to Zuko and Azula. The purpose, Lee, is that it's the royal family. This isn't some common whorehouse tryst with a stable girl. This is our crown prince and princess. If word of this ever got out, if just one whisper escaped these damn trees, it would shatter his reputation. It would be a scandal that would make previous Fire Lords look like saints. Precisely why discretion is paramount, Lee countered, his usual formal tone tinged with a new, grave seriousness. We are soldiers, Sergeant, not gossips. Our loyalty demands silence. Unless the prince himself chooses to address this situation, our duty is to obey and protect. Protect him from what? His own damn self? Rin scoffed. How long has this been going on, Lee? Is this why he's dragged us halfway across the Earth Kingdom on this wild goose chase, to hide what he's doing with his own sister? Is this a punishment? Or a distraction? Lee sighed, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. Those are questions, Sergeant, for which we possess no answers. And conjecture is a dangerous path. Our mandate is to follow orders, not to psychoanalyze the royal family. If this relationship exists, it is a private matter between them. Alarming as it may be, it does not impede his command, nor does it diminish his capabilities as a warrior. He won Nanhai, remember? He killed Fong. He won Nanhai with barely a hair on his ass left, and he walked away half dead. And Azula's credit to him felt, staged, Rin muttered, his voice trailing off. Like she was trying to prove something. To us. To herself. To him. No, Lee. This isn't just a private matter. This is a rotten core that could crumble everything. The argument continued in hushed, tense tones, carried by the rhythm of their march. It was an argument without resolution, a loop of accusation and denial, of gut instinct versus rigid protocol. It persisted through the afternoon sun and into the deepening shadows as dusk began to fall, painting the forest in hues of purple and gray. Finally, as the last rays of sunlight bled from the sky, Zuko signaled a halt. They had reached a small, natural clearing, ringed by ancient, towering trees. Orders were barked, and the soldiers, weary from the long day, set about making camp. Fires were quickly kindled, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to distort the very air around them. Rice was put to boil, and meager rations of dried meat and hardtack were distributed. Rin and Lee sat by one of the smaller fires, picking at their food, their conversation still simmering beneath the surface. The exhausted chatter of the other soldiers, the crackle of the wood, and the distant calls of night birds filled the air, but their own voices remained low, almost conspiratorial. What if it comes out? Rin whispered, tearing a piece of meat with his teeth. What then? Do you think the Fire Lord would just ignore it? Or would he burn them both alive? Lee paused, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Such a scenario is unconscionable. It would destabilize the entire nation. It cannot be allowed to surface. So we just pretend it's not happening? Rin pressed, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. We just ignore the fact that our prince is fucking his sister? What kind of loyalty is that? Before Lee could respond, a sudden, piercing whistle cut through the night, shrill and unexpected. It was not the call of a bird, but something sharp and artificial. Then another, and another, from all directions. Confusion rippled through the camp. Soldiers started to look around, their hands instinctively going to their weapons. But it was too late. Ropes, thick and dark against the fading light, snapped down from the trees. Nets, woven with surprising strength, dropped with terrifying speed. Smoke bombs hissed, spewing thick, acrid clouds that blinded and disoriented. Tripwires, almost invisible in the gloom, sprang up, sending men sprawling. Chaos erupted. A soldier cried out, entangled in a net. Another stumbled, his weapon clattering to the ground as a rope snaked around his legs. The ambush was fast, brutally efficient, and utterly overwhelming. Rin, roaring in surprise and fury, managed to draw his dagger, only for a heavy impact to slam him against the rough bark of a tree. The wind was knocked out of him, and before he could recover, thick, fibrous vines were expertly wrapped around his arms and torso, pinning him tight. He struggled, grunting, but the bindings were impossibly strong. Li, reacting with scholarly precision, tried to duck and roll, but a figure materialized from the smoke, seizing him from behind. A rough hand clapped over his mouth, another expertly twisted his arms behind his back, and a gag was quickly tied. He could only watch in muffled horror as his comrades were subdued. Even Zuko and Azula, who fought with a ferocious, almost desperate intensity, were caught off guard. Zuko unleashed a torrent of fire, forcing several attackers back, while Azula's lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the shadowy figures. But they were simply outnumbered, assailed from all sides by unseen foes using cunning traps and surprising coordination. A heavy net sprang up, entangling Zuko mid-lunge, while Azula, her blue fire flickering defiantly, was swarmed, ropes and bolas wrapping around her limbs until she, too, was brought down with a frustrated snarl. The struggle was over in a matter of moments. The camp, which had just moments ago been a scene of tired camaraderie, was now a tableau of defeated, disarmed, and bound Fire Nation soldiers. The smoke began to dissipate, revealing silent figures moving among the fallen. Then, slowly, from the tree-line, the attackers stepped out of the remaining wisps of smoke. They were not hardened Earth Kingdom soldiers, but a motley crew of ragged teenagers and young adults, their faces smudged with dirt and streaked with camouflage paint. They carried no formal uniforms, only patched clothes, and their weapons were a collection of hooks, ropes, and sharpened sticks, makeshift but clearly effective. Their leader emerged, stepping onto a fallen log in the center of the clearing, surveying the captured Fire Nation soldiers with a smug, almost theatrical grin. He was a boy, no older than Zuko himself, with wild, dark hair that framed a sharp, angular face. A pair of well-worn hook swords were strapped to his back, glinting faintly in the firelight. A tiny grass straw in his mouth. He stood there, silhouetted against the dark trees, his chest puffed out, a defiant fire in his eyes. He pointed a finger at the bound soldiers, his voice ringing with youthful bravado, carrying clearly through the now quiet forest. "I'm Jet," he declared, his smirk widening. "These are the freedom fighters. And tonight, Fire Nation scum, you've marched into the wrong forest." Chapter 64, Freedom Fighters. The last word, forest, hung in the human night air, a smug pronouncement from the wild-haired boy with the sword on his back. Jet. Around him, the other ragged youths of the freedom fighters tightened their circles, their faces smudged with dirt and triumph, their eyes glinting in the dim light of hastily lit torches. The Fire Nation column, once so disciplined and fearsome, lay utterly undone. Ropes bit into wrists and ankles, nets still tangled around some, and the proud crimson armor of the soldiers was marred by dust and the indignity of capture. Zuko, Azula, Rin, Li, and the rest were splayed on the forest floor, their weapons scattered, their dignity stripped away. Jet took a slow, deliberate walk around his captives, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. A smirk played on his lips, a mixture of youthful arrogance and hardened cruelty. He stopped before a young Fire Nation soldier, no older than himself, bound tight against a tree. "Look at them, boys," he announced, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the chirping crickets and distant croak of frogs. "The mighty Fire Nation. The butchers who burn our homes, steal our food, slaughter our families. And here they are, trussed up like boars for the feast." His gaze swept over them, lingering on Zuko, then Azula. "You think you're so special, don't you? With your fancy uniforms and your fire-spitting magic." He kicked gently at a discarded helmet, sending it skittering. "Well, your magic doesn't work so well when you're caught like rats in a trap, does it? Even the great crown prince," he sneered, finally stopping before Zuko, who lay face down, his hands bound behind his back. "Just a boy in the dirt, like the rest of them." Azula, though bound tightly enough to strain the ropes across her chest, managed to lift her head, her golden eyes flashing with pure unadulterated venom. "You dirty little peasant," she hissed, her voice low and cutting. "When I get free, I'll roast you alive. I'll make you scream for mercy." Jet chuckled, a hollow, humorless sound. He knelt, bringing his face close to hers, his smirk widening. "Oh, is that a promise, princess? Because right now, all I hear is a lot of words from a girl who can't even move her fingers. You Fire Nation nobles," he spat, "you all think you're untouchable. You think your name shields you. Well, not here. Here, you bleed like the rest of us." He poked her cheek with a dirty finger, drawing a furious snarl from Azula. "And these," Jet continued, pushing himself back to his feet and gesturing to his followers, "these are the people you burn. These are the ones who fight back." He started to introduce them, each stepping forward with their own brand of menace. "This is Smellerbee." A girl with tangled brown hair and a sharp, calculating stare stepped forward. She wore a tattered green tunic and carried a pair of wickedly curved blades. She eyed Azula. "She's not so pretty without her makeup, is she, Jet? Looks just like any other Fire Nation piglet." And Longshot, Jet pointed to a tall, lanky boy who said nothing, merely raising his longbow and nocking an arrow, aiming it silently at the bound soldiers, his eyes impassive. The tension in the clearing ratcheted up a notch. "Pipsqueak, here," Jet clapped a hand on the shoulder of a towering boy who looked more like a giant, armed with a club made from a tree branch. "He thinks you're all Fire Nation pigs trussed up for slaughter." Pipsqueak grunted in agreement, flexing his thick arms. And the Duke, a much younger boy, barely older than a child, eagerly stepped forward, clutching a small, crude spear. His eyes shone with a zealot's fervor as he parroted Jet. "Yeah. Pigs for slaughter. You burned our homes." Rin, straining against his bindings, spat on the dirt nearby, his face contorted with rage. "Children playing soldier. You think you're heroes? You're just a band of pathetic, unwashed brats." Jet's eyes narrowed, the lightness draining from his face, replaced by a cold, hard glint. "Children," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "These children have killed more Fire Nation than you could count, old man. Every scar you see here," he gestured to the visible marks on his own arms and the faces of his comrades, "every blade, every trick, it's all been bought with Fire Nation blood. Your blood." He turned back to Zuko, a more intense focus in his gaze. He had sensed it from the moment of capture, the way the others, even Azula, had subtly deferred to him. His armor, though now dusty, was of finer make, his bearing, even in defeat, carried an undeniable weight. "So, who's the man of the hour?" "The Great Fire Prince, eh? What's your name, boy? And your rank, if you still have one?" Zuko, his spine stiff even while prone, slowly lifted his head. His golden eyes, usually so expressive, were now like chips of amber, burning with a contained fury. He said nothing, only glared. "Cat got your tongue?" Jet mocked. He knelt again, pulling one of Zuko's bound wrists, forcing him to shift uncomfortably. "Going to keep your little secrets?" "Doesn't matter. We know who you are. The banished son, the scarred boy chasing after shadows." Jet leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "And now look at you, caught like a rat in my forest." Zuko gave a low growl, a sound of pure animalistic rage. "You'll regret this," he rasped, his voice raw. Rin, meanwhile, was thrashing against his ropes. "Let me go, you coward. Fight me like a man. Not with your nets and your traps." Jet merely laughed again, a harsh, dismissive sound that grated on the nerves. "Why should I? You think honor wins wars? Honor gets people killed. Cunning keeps us alive. Ask your princess here how well honor worked for her when we dropped a net on her head." Azula let out a frustrated hiss, biting back a retort. Lee, bound but surprisingly composed, spoke with his usual precise, intellectual cadence. He had observed Jet carefully since the ambush. "Your confidence, while impressive in its execution of this ambush, is also your greatest weakness. Rashness and arrogance often precede downfall, especially when confronting an enemy whose capabilities you do not fully comprehend. We are merely a scouting party. Jet sneered at Lee. Capabilities? Sounds like fancy Fire Nation schooling talking. We comprehend just fine, scholar. We comprehend that you came into our forest, and now you're our prisoners. He stood, signaling his fighters. All right, boys, girls. Time for a little souvenir hunting. Let's see what treasures these Fire Nation scouts are carrying. The freedom fighters moved in, hands reaching, roughly searching the bound soldiers. Weapons were quickly confiscated, Zuko's broadswords, Azula's sharp daggers, the soldiers' spears and daggers. Pouches were emptied, revealing rations, jerky, dried fruit, hardtack which were eagerly snatched up by the hungry youths. Their water skins were taken, their meager personal effects rifled through. The humiliation deepened as armor pieces were unbuckled and stripped away with rough hands, leaving the soldiers shivering slightly in their lighter undertunics against the cool night air. Azula, in particular, was incandescent with fury as her chest plate and arm guards were removed, her face contorted into a mask of pure hatred, hissing threats under her breath that Jet merely ignored with a smirk. One of the younger freedom fighters, a boy with a chipped tooth, gripped his spear tightly. Jet, why not just finish them? Save us the trouble. Jet spun on him, his eyes hard. No. Not yet. We need information. And more importantly, he gazed at Zuko and Azula, a cruel glint in his eyes. We need to show everyone what happens when the Fire Nation dares to step foot in our territory. We're taking them back to the hideout. To the swamp. They'll be paraded as trophies for all to see. A murmur of agreement went through the freedom fighters. Ropes were tightened again, and the prisoners were roughly pulled to their feet, stumbling forward, forced to move. The march through the forest began anew, but this time, the roles were reversed. The Fire Nation soldiers, bound and beaten, were dragged along, their feet catching on roots and stones. The air grew heavier, the scent of damp earth and decay replacing the fresh forest aroma. The ground became soft, squelching underfoot. The buzz of cicadas faded, replaced by the droning hum of mosquitoes and the croaking symphony of unseen swamp creatures. The trees grew thicker, their branches draped with moss, creating a dark, oppressive canopy. Finally, through a dense thicket, a clearing opened up, revealing a hidden stronghold. It was a ruined, overgrown camp, built into the ancient trees and partially submerged in the swampy water. Banners crudely fashioned from scavenged cloth hung between trees, rope bridges swayed precariously, connecting makeshift wooden platforms, and rickety watchtowers peered over the canopy. Lights flickered from within, casting eerie shadows. As they were dragged into the heart of this crude encampment, past the surprised faces of other freedom fighters, Jet cast a final, cold glance back at Zuko. Welcome to your new home, Prince. Hope you like the dirt, you'll be eating it for a long time. Chapter 65, Power of the Fire Prince. The snap of the ropes was unnaturally loud in the suddenly silent clearing, a sharp, decisive crack that echoed the breaking of an illusion. The bindings, singed and frayed, fell from Zuko's wrists and ankles in smoking fragments, landing with soft hisses on the damp earth. Until that moment, the freedom fighters had been a cacophony of jeers and triumphant boasts, their ragged forms backlit by the flickering campfires, their faces contorted in smug satisfaction. But the sound, and the sight of the crown prince of the Fire Nation standing, utterly unbound, brought an immediate, chilling halt to their revelry. Zuko straightened to his full height, a figure of lean, coiled power that seemed to absorb the very light around him. His golden amber eyes, steady and unflinching, held no trace of fear or anger, only a profound, almost terrifying calm. He had been testing the strength of the hemp for minutes, a subtle current of heat flowing from his fingertips, just enough to weaken the fibers without drawing attention. The final, searing surge had been a silent command, a primal assertion of his will over matter. He took a single, unhurried step forward, the dry leaves under his boots crunching softly. The movement was deliberate, almost languid, a stark contrast to the frantic, scattered energy of the young rebels now frozen in their tracks. Jet, his grin slowly dissolving into a grimace of dawning horror, instinctively tightened his grip on his twin-hook swords. He swallowed, the sound audible in the sudden, heavy silence that had fallen like a shroud over the forest clearing. Then, Zuko inhaled, a deep, measured breath that seemed to draw in the very air around him, a prelude to something inevitable. As he exhaled, a long, controlled stream of crimson gold fire poured from his mouth, not a wild burst, but a ribbon of pure, incandescent heat. It stretched outward, a living, roaring entity, reflecting in the wide, disbelieving eyes of the nearest freedom fighter, a lanky youth named Longshot, who had been aiming an arrow. The flame, impossibly, did not dissipate. Instead, Zuko extended his left arm, a graceful, sweeping motion, and the breath fire followed the subtle command of his hand, curving like a fiery whip. It wrapped around Longshot's bow, the wood instantly blackening and splintering with a sharp crack before the heat snapped back, a living extension of Zuko's will, dissipating just before it touched the boy's terrified face. Longshot stumbled backward, dropping his useless weapon, his hands reflexively flying to shield himself from the residual heat, his face pale with utter shock. The fire that had just been expelled from his lungs was now a dancing, sentient entity, responding to every twitch of Zuko's fingers. He didn't clench his fists in rage, his movements were open, almost artistic, like a conductor guiding an orchestra of destruction. One moment, his palm was open, a small, vibrant orb of fire hovering above it, crimson at its core, flaring to orange at its edges. With a flick of his wrist, the orb shot forward, not to burn, but to strike. It collided with the chest of Pipsqueak, the burly freedom fighter, who grunted as the concussive force knocked the wind out of him, sending him sprawling into the dirt, momentarily stunned. Zuko spun, a swift, fluid rotation that brought his back to the smoldering ropes and his front to the bewildered rebels. His right leg swept out, not in a kick, but in a low, controlled arc. As his foot met the air, a crescent blade of intense, orange and red flame erupted from his soul, shimmering with an unearthly glow. The blade glided along the ground, cutting a fiery path, not against flesh, but against the very earth itself, throwing up scorched dirt and sending Smellerbee, who had been rushing him with a dagger, skidding backwards, her boots losing purchase on the suddenly slick, superheated soil. She landed hard, the air knocked from her lungs, clutching at her arm where the heat had raised an angry red welt. Terrifying, Rin muttered, his voice barely a whisper, yet infused with a strange, dark admiration. He twisted against his ropes, pulling futilely. His eyes, usually so sharp and observant, were wide, fixed on his prince. He actually breathes it. Like a dragon. Lee, still bound beside him, merely watched, his breathing steady, his gaze following the intricate dance of Zuko's flames. It wasn't a display of uncontrolled power, it was a demonstration of absolute control. The way Zuko's movements flowed, the precision of each strike, the subtle variations in the fire's intensity and color, it was a master painter at work, except his medium was pure destructive energy. Lee's analytical mind was already dissecting the angles, the shifts in weight, the subtle hand gestures that guided the inferno. He saw not just a fighter, but an artist of war. Azula, tied securely, a gag still preventing her sharp retorts, watched with an almost predatory intensity. A slow, knowing smirk spread across her lips. Her eyes glittered with a complex mixture of pride for her brother's raw, undeniable power, and a familiar, bitter envy that she wasn't the one orchestrating this beautiful, brutal ballet of fire. She saw the elegance, the controlled ferocity, the sheer, unadulterated swagger in his every move. This was Zuko unleashed, not the banished prince, but the true heir to the Fire Lord's legacy. Zuko continued his advance, a predator moving through a flock of scattered prey. He raised his hands, palms outward, and two jets of fire, thick as tree trunks, erupted from them. He didn't aim to incinerate. Instead, he bent them, curving the twin streams inwards, creating a blazing archway. Two more freedom fighters, who had tried to charge him from either side, found themselves trapped within the fiery embrace, unable to move forward or back, their faces contorted in fear as the roaring heat pressed in on them. Zuko then tightened his fists, and the archway collapsed inward, not engulfing them, but slamming them with pure concussive force, sending them sprawling and gasping for air. He moved with a deadly grace, a silent dance in the flickering firelight. He sidestepped a wild swing from a freedom fighter with a rusty axe, letting the momentum carry him. As the axe-wielder stumbled past, Zuko extended a finger, and a fine, almost invisible thread of heat shot out, severing the strap of the axe, sending the weapon clattering to the ground. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, a controlled burst of flame erupted from his palm, just enough to scorch the man's clothing and send him yelping and rolling on the ground, frantically trying to pat out the embers. The clearing, once vibrant with their defiant shouts, was now filled only with the crackle of Zuko's flames, the terrified whimpers of the injured, and the heavy breathing of those still standing. The freedom fighters, so bold moments ago, were now a broken, terrified scattering of individuals, their confidence shattered, their eyes fixed on the approaching inferno that walked. Zuko was not running, nor was he rushing. He strode, taking each step with the deliberate pace of a monarch surveying his domain, fire blooming and receding at his command, an extension of his own formidable will. One by one, they fell. A precise kick, not of earth-shattering force, but perfectly placed to disrupt balance and send a fighter tumbling. A focused jet of flame, aimed not at the body, but at the ground just before a running rebel's feet, turning the earth into a treacherous, smoking pit. A quick, almost imperceptible hand movement that sent a wave of heat, disarming a struggling fighter. There was no anger in his eyes, no grimace of exertion on his face. He simply was, and the fire obeyed. Eventually, the field was cleared. Only Jet remained standing, his stance wide, his twin hook swords drawn and gleaming in the erratic firelight. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, scorched earth, and smoldering leaves. Around him, his companions lay incapacitated, some moaning, others merely still, their defiance completely extinguished. Jet was breathing hard, sweat plastering strands of dark hair to his forehead, his chest heaving with exertion and pure, unadulterated fury. He watched Zuko approach, his golden eyes unwavering, his movements so effortless, so devastatingly graceful. Jet's own heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming silence. He knew, with a cold certainty that seeped into his bones, that he was utterly outmatched. Yet, the defiance that fueled him, the burning hatred for the Fire Nation that had defined his life, forbade him from backing down. He would fall, but he would not yield. The firelight danced on his curved blades, reflecting his unyielding resolve as he stood alone, facing down the Crown Prince of the Fire Nation. Chapter 66, Zuko vs. Jet. Zuko stopped a few paces from Jet, the air between them shimmering with residual heat. His ropes, scorched and brittle, had fallen away unnoticed during the short, brutal display of his power, leaving him unencumbered. His posture was deceptively calm, a relaxed readiness that spoke of absolute control, but his golden eyes were keen, sharp as honed blades, assessing Jet with an unnerving intensity. He began to walk, slow and deliberate, a soft rustle of leaves beneath his boots the only sound besides Jet's ragged breathing. He moved in a lazy circle around the young man, a predator scenting its prey, his form silhouetted against the smoldering backdrop of the forest. His voice, when it came, was a low, even murmur, devoid of anger, yet laced with an almost chilling smugness. "You know, Jet," Zuko began, his gaze sweeping over the fallen freedom fighters, then back to the defiant figure before him. "I used to be a fan." He paused, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. "Not in the way you might think, of course. Not of your cause. But of you." Jet's eyes narrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, momentarily eclipsing the fury. He shifted his weight, his grip tightening on his hook swords, trying to make sense of the strange words. His allies, scattered and groaning, stirred faintly at Zuko's bizarre confession, murmurs of disbelief rising from the dirt where they lay. Rin and Lee exchanged wide-eyed glances, while even Azula, though gagged, raised an eyebrow, a spark of interest in her calculating gaze. Zuko's slow walk continued, completing a full circle before he stopped directly in front of Jet again, his eyes locking with the younger man's. The straw of grass in your mouth, he continued, his voice almost nostalgic, yet still dangerously calm. The unique hook swords, always gleaming. The charisma. The way people followed you, believed in you, despite your questionable methods. He tilted his head slightly, a thoughtful expression on his face. You were a symbol, for a time. A rebellion in miniature. Jet stared, his brow furrowed, a mixture of shock and suspicion warring in his expression. No one, let alone a Fire Nation prince, had ever spoken to him like this. It was unsettling, disorienting. Zuko's voice dropped, becoming a little softer, almost conspiratorial. You're supposed to have a horrible and stupid ending, Jet. His gaze was unwavering, piercing. Trapped. Manipulated. Left to die alone in an underground tunnel, under a broken city. A forgotten casualty of a war you barely understood. He took a single, deliberate step closer. But I can give you a better one. The words struck Jet like a physical blow. His eyes widened, his jaw slackening slightly. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice hoarse, laced with a new kind of fear, one born of the unknown. How do you know all that? What ending? Who are you? He gripped his swords tighter, the familiar weight a small comfort against the sudden, chilling pronouncements. Explain yourself, Fire Nation scum. Zuko merely smirked, a faint, unsettling curve of his lips. He said nothing further, letting the cryptic words hang in the heavy air, a new layer of dread added to the scent of smoke and fear. Before Jet could press him, a sharp, sudden exhale of fire ripped through the air. Azula, with a fierce snarl, had freed herself. Her bindings, though thick and numerous, had been incinerated by a focused, explosive breath, leaving her hands free. She flicked a wrist, and the smoldering remnants of rope fell to the ground. Her eyes, identical to Zuko's in color, but radiating a colder, more cruel light, fixed on her brother. Playing master recruiter, Zuko? Her voice dripped with scorn, cutting through the tension like a razor. She stepped forward, her movements predatorily graceful, unhampered by her previous captivity. You think he's worth saving? She gestured disdainfully at Jet with a flick of her fingers, as if brushing away a fly. He's a street rat with cheap swords. Kill him and be done with it. You're softening. Without waiting for a response, Azula raised her hand. A concussive stream of pure, blistering blue fire erupted from her palm, shooting forth with the speed of an arrow, aimed directly at Jet's chest. The air shrieked as it passed, superheated and vibrating with destructive energy. Jet, despite his shock and fatigue, reacted with an animalistic quickness. He was already in motion before the fire fully manifested, an almost impossible blur of limbs and steel. He twisted, flipping backward over a fallen log, the blue inferno missing him by mere inches, obliterating the log where he'd stood, sending splinters and scorched earth exploding outwards. He didn't stop. He rolled, somersaulted, and then sprung off the trunk of a gnarled oak, using its rough bark to launch himself into the air. His hooked swords flashed, cutting through drooping branches as he went, creating new paths, new angles of evasion. He was a whirlwind of motion, a fleeting shadow darting through the trees. The concussive fire followed, a terrifying blue serpent of destruction. Where it touched, the world dissolved. Trees cracked and exploded into fragments of wood and steam, the ground erupted in geysers of dirt and pebbles, leaving smoking craters. A thick cloud of dust and acrid smoke billowed through the clearing, making the air hazy, obscuring sight and sound. Zuko watched, his expression unreadable as Jet weaved through the destruction, his agility almost supernatural. Then, his eyes, golden fire themselves, finally settled on Azula. His aura, which had been controlled and precise, flared outwards, not in a visible burst of flame, but as an invisible, suffocating pressure that seemed to drain the very oxygen from the air. It was a primal, ancient force, a silent roar of dominance that vibrated deep in the bones. Even Azula, for all her unwavering confidence, felt it, a cold tendril of something akin to caution tightening around her chest, a faint surprise on her face at the sheer, unadulterated power emanating from her brother. Zuko's voice was a low growl, barely a whisper, yet it cut through the lingering echoes of Azula's fire like a blade through silk. That won't be happening again. Azula's eyes narrowed, a challenge sparking within them, but she held her ground, sensing the shift in the very atmosphere around Zuko. The air itself seemed to crackle with his barely restrained force. For now, she retreated a step, content to watch the inevitable clash. Jet, having successfully evaded Azula's attack, landed lightly on a moss-covered boulder, his chest heaving, his hook swords held ready. He had no time to question Azula's inexplicable presence or his own close call. His eyes were fixed on Zuko, who now stood before him, a storm in waiting. "So, you want to play, Fire Prince?" Jet snarled, his voice tinged with a desperate edge but still defiant. "Then let's play." With a guttural yell, he launched himself forward, a blur of motion, his hook sword singing as they cut through the air. Jet's opening assault was a controlled frenzy, driven by pure, honed instinct. He charged in low, an almost animalistic crouch, one hook sword sweeping out in a wide, deceiving arc aimed to catch Zuko's ankles and instantly unbalance him. Simultaneously, the other hook sword, held higher, slashed in a rapid, vertical trajectory, seeking to rip through Zuko's torso. He didn't just run. He flowed, his body twisting and flipping even as he advanced, adding unpredictable shifts to his attack. He bounced off a low-hanging branch, gaining a split second of aerial advantage, trying to overwhelm Zuko with sheer speed and the deceptive angles of his blades. Zuko met the onslaught with a calm that bordered on unnerving. His response was immediate and fluid, fire bending as if it were an extension of his very will, a tangible part of his body. As Jet's low blade swept, Zuko lifted his foot in a swift, defensive kick, a stream of fire bursting from his heel, not directly at Jet, but creating a momentary wall of heat and light that deflected the hook sword's trajectory just enough to save his leg. Before Jet's high slash could connect, Zuko twisted his torso, letting the blade skim past his armored bracer with a shower of sparks, simultaneously thrusting his left fist forward. A focused burst of orange-red flame erupted, not a wide arc but a concentrated spearhead of heat aimed directly at Jet's center mass. Jet, incredibly, anticipated the counter. He arched his back, twisting in midair, allowing the fiery spear to whistle past his chest. As he landed, his right hook sword whipped out, aiming to disarm Zuko, but Zuko's left arm snapped up, his forearm guard taking the impact with a metallic clang. Sparks flew anew, reflecting in Zuko's impassive eyes. With a swift, internal shift of his chi, Zuko's right hand produced a rapid whip of fire, a crackling, serpentine lash that curved around Jet's guard, seeking to wrap around his weapon arm or entangle his legs. The fire snarled and snapped, alive and hungry, an extension of Zuko's controlled intent. Jet was forced to disengage, leaping back with a grunt. He landed, skidding slightly, and instantly spun into a wide overhead slash with both swords, aiming to cleave Zuko in half. Zuko ducked under the combined attack with practiced ease, the twin blades whistling inches above his head. As Jet's momentum carried him slightly forward, Zuko pivoted, a palm strike bursting with flame erupting from his hand, aimed at Jet's exposed side. Jet, again, rolled with the impact, deflecting the worst of the heat, his body a blur as he tumbled away. But he wasn't finished. He kicked outwards, sending a spray of dirt, dust, and scorched leaves into Zuko's face, hoping to blind him, even for a second. As the grit hit Zuko's eyes, Jet used the momentary distraction, lunging through the haze. His left hook sword shot out, the curved blade aiming to hook around Zuko's neck, while his right arm came around with a powerful elbow strike. Zuko, however, was already reacting. Even with his vision momentarily obscured, his internal senses were sharp. He spun on his heel, a controlled whirlwind, and as he turned, flames trailed from his outflung leg like a fiery crescent moon, not only clearing the dirt from his eyes but forcing Jet to pull back his hook sword to avoid getting his hand incinerated. The elbow strike glanced off Zuko's shoulder armor with a dull thud. Jet, retreating slightly, didn't hesitate. He was a master of guerrilla tactics, using the environment as readily as his blades. He launched himself onto a thick, low-hanging vine, swinging upwards with explosive power, his lean frame propelling him through the branches. He used the canopy to his advantage, swinging from one thick branch to another, a furious arboreal phantom. He struck from above, dropping down with both hook swords aimed in a downward crisscross, trying to catch Zuko off guard. Zuko, however, was not easily surprised. He stood his ground, a calm, almost arrogant figure amidst Jet's frantic movements. Every time Jet swooped or lunged close, Zuko responded with wide, sweeping arcs of fire, creating a defensive perimeter of heat that forced Jet to veer away, denying him solid footing or a clear line of attack. Zuko's firebending was precise, rhythmic, always measured, yet it carried an undeniable weight, a physical presence that pressed down on Jet with every beat. The intensity of the heat radiating from Zuko and his bending began to actively dry the air around them, turning the forest floor into a desiccated, crackling expanse. Jet felt the change acutely, sweat plastered his hair to his temples, stinging his eyes, and his movements, though still agile, began to feel heavier, each breath a little harder to draw. Jet grew more desperate, his attacks becoming wilder, less calculated, relying more on raw speed and ferocity. He was a cornered animal, fighting for his life. Zuko, in contrast, grew even more composed, his posture straightening slightly, a hint of something resembling disdain in his eyes. "You fight well," Zuko said, his voice a mocking whisper that cut through Jet's labored breathing. "For a boy with toys." Jet snarled, the insult igniting a fresh surge of fury. "I'll never kneel to Fire Nation scum," he spat, his voice raw with hatred. He tightened his grip on his hook swords, his muscles straining, and launched into his most committed attack yet. With a primal roar, he swung both hook swords in a powerful, desperate crisscross, a tearing, cleaving motion aimed directly at Zuko's chest, hoping to slice through armored and flesh alike. Zuko met the wild, desperate charge with an unyielding stance. As the twin blades converged on him, he didn't dodge. Instead, he lunged into the attack, his hands erupting with a controlled, concussive blast of fire that slammed into the flat of Jet's blades, not to melt them, but to throw them off course with overwhelming force. The impact vibrated through Jet's arms, threatening to rip the swords from his grasp, sending a jolt up to his shoulders. He stumbled back, fighting to regain his footing, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and wild. Zuko, having deflected the attack, stood poised, a faint plume of smoke curling from his scorched gauntlets. Jet, panting heavily, glared back, his blades still clutched in his shaking hands. Between them, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and effort, firelight dancing on polished steel, two warriors locked in a silent, tense standoff, the battle for another moment frozen in time. Chapter 67, Zuko vs. Jet, 2. The brief lull shattered with Zuko's next breath. The stillness that had defined him through the initial skirmish, the almost casual parrying of Jet's desperate attacks, vanished. A deeper crimson light, like embers stirring within a forge, ignited in his scarred eye. His posture, which moments ago had been composed and almost aloof, now coiled, tightening like a predator ready to spring. A low, guttural growl, barely perceptible, rumbled in his throat, a sound of primal intent, distinct from any words he might have uttered. Then, he moved. It wasn't just speed, it was an acceleration of being. His feet, previously planted with deliberate precision, now became blurs of motion, a rapid-fire rhythm of steps that covered ground with impossible swiftness. He didn't just run, he flowed, his body a sleek, burning arrow. One moment he was 10 feet from Jet, the next he was closing the distance, a whirlwind of motion. Jet, poised for an attack, barely registered the shift before Zuko was upon him, not with a direct lunge, but with an intricate dance of footwork, a sidestep here, a pivot there, each movement gaining ground, flanking, feinting. Fire erupted from Zuko, not in simple bursts, but in a symphony of controlled fury. From his right palm, a serpentine whip of flame lashed out, coiling and snapping with an intelligence of its own, lunging for Jet's lead arm. As Jet instinctively pulled his hook sword back to parry, a second, wider arc of fire burst from Zuko's left heel, sweeping low, aiming to destabilize his footing. Jet, caught between the two attacks, leapt backwards, his body twisting midair with acrobatic grace, barely avoiding the fiery whip that scorched the air where his arm had been and the fiery sweep that would have tripped him. But Zuko was already there. His movements were no longer just about offensive strikes, they were a complex, fluid expression of his entire being. As Jet landed, Zuko was already spinning, his silhouette momentarily wreathed in a halo of crimson light. With the spin, fire didn't just follow, it extended, a fiery cloak that widened into searing, claw-like talons of energy that raked towards Jet. Jet's eyes, usually keen and calculating, widened in genuine surprise. He was fast, perhaps faster than any non-bender Zuko had faced, but Zuko was now everywhere at once. He ducked under one fiery claw, another flashed past his ear, the heat searing his hair. He tried to counter with a swift, desperate slash of his left hook sword, but Zuko's right hand was already coming up, not to block, but to unleash a torrent of flame that erupted from his palm like a miniature sun, forcing Jet to shield his face, momentarily blinded by the intense glare. In that split second, Zuko's left leg snapped out, a kick charged with raw fire, the flame lashing out like a whip, forcing Jet to abandon his guard and throw himself backwards to avoid the burning impact. Jet's breathing hitched, his previous confidence replaced by a stark, growing panic. His blade work, normally fluid and precise, became jerky, frantic. He spun his hook swords in desperate, blurring defenses, trying to ward off the incessant, multi-angled attacks. Fire erupted from Zuko's mouth now, a focused, almost guttural roar of flame that painted the air crimson, forcing Jet to roll across the forest floor, his uniform singed, the smell of burnt cloth filling his nostrils. Zuko was no longer just matching Jet, he was overwhelming him. His footwork was a blur of calculated chaos, his body a conduit for the element. When he spun, fire spun with him, a vortex of heat. When he kicked, fire lashed out, long and hungry, like a viper's tongue. When he flipped over a low branch, a trail of fiery wings seemed to sprout from his back, propelling him forward, closing the distance once more. Jet, for the first time, looked truly afraid. He could hardly predict where the next attack would come from, nor could he find a moment to breathe, to formulate a counter or an escape. His dodges were no longer confident, strategic retreats, but desperate, almost clumsy attempts to avoid incineration. His blades, once his proud extensions, now seemed to barely scrape against the edge of the inferno, offering increasingly futile protection. The air around them vibrated with the raw power Zuko was unleashing. The dried leaves on the forest floor crackled and some spontaneously combusted, adding the scent of wood smoke to the ozone. Jet felt the heat not just on his skin, but deep in his bones, an oppressive weight that threatened to buckle his knees. Each time he parried or dodged, he saw Zuko not just as a skilled opponent, but as a force of nature, an elemental tempest incarnate, and the realization hit him, he was not fighting a human anymore, he was fighting a living, breathing flame. Zuko saw the terror flicker in Jet's eyes, the moment the young man's spirit began to waver, and he pressed his advantage with merciless precision. This was no longer a duel of honor, but a brutal, surgical takedown. Jet, desperate, blindly swung his right hook sword in a wide, sweeping arc, aiming to create distance, to gain a moment of respite. But Zuko anticipated it. With a movement too fast for the eye to truly follow, Zuko ducked under the blade, his body low, almost scraping the earth. As he came up, his shoulder slammed into Jet's chest with the force of a battering ram. The impact drove the breath from Jet's lungs in a pained gasp, sending him staggering back several paces, off balance. Jet, however, was resilient. He twisted, attempting a desperate backflip to escape, to regain his footing and composure. But Zuko was on him instantly, a fiery shadow. Before Jet's feet even touched the ground, Zuko was there, flames licking at his heels, denying him any chance to recover. Then, the rhythm began. Zuko's attacks became a savage, relentless drumbeat. His fists, each one sheathed in searing flame, hammered towards Jet. The first flaming punch landed square on Jet's forearm, which he had instinctively thrown up to guard. The impact was not just physical, it scorched the cloth of his sleeve, leaving an angry red well beneath, forcing a grunt of pain from Jet's lips. Before Jet could even fully process the hit, Zuko's left fist, equally ablaze, struck his side, tearing through his tunic with a searing caress, singeing skin, making the air heavier with the smell of burnt hair and desperation. Jet reeled, his guard faltering, but he tried to bring his remaining hook sword up. Zuko was too fast. A flaming knee drove into Jet's thigh, causing his leg to buckle. Each impact was not just a strike, but a searing brand, a message of absolute dominance. Jet stumbled, his vision blurring, the heat from Zuko's fists radiating through every point of contact. He tried to pivot, tried to create space, but Zuko was omnipresent, a relentless firestorm. Flaming fists slammed into his shoulders, his chest, his arms, a blur of crimson and orange that forced Jet into a purely defensive crouch, his hook swords flailing wildly, barely deflecting the worst of the blows. In a final act of defiance, Jet wound up for a desperate, wild upward slash with his remaining hook sword, a desperate gamble for Zuko's midsection. It was a raw, untrained strike, born of panic. As the blade arced upwards, Zuko moved. His left hand shot out like a viper, his gauntlet fingers clamping around Jet's wrist mid-swing with an iron grip. Fire, as if in recognition of its master's intent, blazed up Zuko's arm, not consuming Jet, but searing his skin, the intense heat scorching his hand, forcing a choked scream from his throat. The pain was unbearable, immediate, and utterly debilitating. Jet's grip on the hook sword faltered, his muscles spasming, and with a metallic clatter, the weapon clanged to the hardened earth, spinning away, a defeated silver crescent. As Jet reeled, his sword gone, Zuko didn't hesitate. With a primal roar, he gathered all his intent, all his power into his right palm. A concussive blast of fire, denser and hotter than anything he had unleashed before, surged from his hand. He slammed the fiery palm into Jet's stomach, not just pushing, but blasting him. The force was immense, explosive. Jet's eyes bulged, a silent gasp escaping his lips as he was lifted clean off his feet, propelled backwards by the sheer kinetic energy of the firebender's strike. He flew through the air, a ragdoll, before slamming into the dirt with a sickening thud, impacting hard enough to create a distinct crater in the scorched earth where he landed, winded, broken, and utterly defeated. He lay there, gasping for air, his body bruised and burned, his mind reeling. Before he could even twitch, before he could muster a single thought of regaining his feet, Zuko was standing over him. His scarred face, etched with a grim determination, loomed above. A focused, scorching flame, no larger than his palm, but radiating an unbearable intensity, hovered just inches from Jet's throat, its heat so potent that Jet could feel the skin beginning to crackle, the scent of burning flesh already reaching his nostrils. Jet's eyes, wide with pain and humiliation, met Zuko's. He tried to speak, but only a ragged, desperate wheeze escaped. The flame pulsed, a silent threat, a promise of excruciating agony if he dared resist. His body screamed in protest, every muscle screaming for release. With a final, crushing wave of despair, Jet closed his eyes, a single, bitter tear tracking a path through the grime on his cheek. He couldn't fight anymore. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe under the weight of the prince's absolute power. He was beaten. Surrender was the only option. The fire, still held steady, flickered, seeming to acknowledge his internal capitulation. Zuko stood tall, his chest heaving, steam rising faintly from his scorched gauntlets, mingling with the smoke that curled from patches on Jet's uniform. His own skin bore a few minor scrapes, and a thin line of blood trickled from a shallow cut on his cheek where Jet's last desperate slash had grazed him, but his stance was unwavering, his gaze steady. Jet lay sprawled in the crater, his body a map of bruising and burns, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. His two hook swords lay several feet away, reflecting the flickering firelight, stark symbols of his defeat. Moments later, Fire Nation soldiers, having finally managed to free themselves from the vines and regain their formation, rushed forward, their faces a mix of awe and grim satisfaction. They quickly bound Jet's wrists and ankles with sturdy ropes, pulling him roughly to his feet. Even then, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and grime, Jet glared up at Zuko with a fierce, youthful defiance that refused to be extinguished. He spat a mouthful of blood and dirt onto the scorched ground at Zuko's feet, his eyes burning with hatred. He would not beg. He would not give Zuko the satisfaction. But Zuko merely regarded him for a long moment, his gaze unreadable, cold. There was no triumph in his expression, no gloating. Just a detached acknowledgement of a task completed. Then, with a slow, deliberate turn, he walked away, his dominance absolute, leaving Jet to the grim ministrations of the soldiers. As Zuko moved towards the group of his soldiers still struggling with the remaining vine bindings, a murmur of awe rippled through the onlookers. Rin, his face smudged with dirt but his eyes shining, nudged Lee subtly, his voice hushed. "Did you see that, Lee?" Rin whispered, a tremor of disbelief in his tone. "Months ago, I thought Prince Zuko was a reckless boy, capable of grand gestures, yes, like the miniature sun at Nanhai, or those tidal flames, but this precise brutality, the speed, the agility, he moved like an elemental spirit itself." He shook his head, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow, though he hadn't fought. "I thought I knew the limits of firebending. He's mastering things I never thought possible, not with such speed." Lee, ever the pragmatist, watched Zuko systematically free his men with focused bursts of fire that vaporized the vines, his expression thoughtful, almost clinical. "Sergeant, his growth is exponential. We've seen him command overwhelming, wide-scale attacks, yes, but this level of precision in close quarters, the way his fire coils and snaps, it's unnerving. It's no longer about sheer power, but absolute control, a perfect integration of mind and body and element." He paused, his gaze fixed on the prince's retreating back. "If he continues at this rate, it won't be long before he rivals the Fire Lord himself. He's no longer just the Fire Prince in title. He's becoming it in truth." Rin let out a low, almost involuntary breath. That both inspires me and terrifies me, Lee." He watched Zuko, his prince, his general, move amongst the cheering soldiers, a hero in their eyes. The sheer, untamed power he had just witnessed was a beacon, but also a chilling testament to the unpredictable might of the royal bloodline. Unseen, standing partially obscured by the dense foliage at the forest's edge, Azula had overheard every hushed word. A disdainful, almost sneering look played across her perfect features as she watched Rin and Lee speak of her brother's growing power with reverence, their voices laced with a fear they were barely trying to conceal. Their awe grated on her, a discordant note in her carefully constructed symphony of control. She watched as Zuko, amidst the shouts of praise from his freed soldiers, turned to accept their salutes, his head held high, a figure of undeniable authority and nascent power. Jet, bruised and bound, lay defiant at his feet, but his impotence was clear. The shouts of "Long live Prince Zuko" echoed through the trees. Azula's smile, which had been a thin, cruel slash across her lips, vanished. Her golden eyes narrowed, losing their casual contempt, hardening into something cold and calculating. The more he grew, the more formidable he became, the harder he would be to control, to manipulate, to eventually, perhaps, remove. The thought, a venomous seed, blossomed in her mind. Perhaps, she mused, her hand unconsciously flexing, she would have to act sooner rather than later. The jungle around her seemed to darken, even as the setting sun cast long, fiery shadows. Unseen, unheard, Azula began to plan. Chapter 68, Poway Fortress. Perhaps, she mused, her hand unconsciously flexing, she would have to act so. The short reprieve from the forest's humid embrace offered little comfort to the freedom fighters. Bound and gagged, they were herded onto Zuko's sleek, black cavern, cutting through the forest with an unsettling grace. The air inside was sharp with salt and the faint tang of coal smoke from the distance, a constant reminder of the Fire Nation's dominance. Jet, his body still aching from Zuko's brutal efficiency, felt the cold iron of the manacles bite into his wrists. His hook swords, extensions of his own will, had been summarily confiscated, tossed to another soldier as if they were common tools. His trademark straw, usually chewed with an almost insouciant swagger, now remained clutched in a silent, rigid jaw, ground between his teeth as a pressure valve for the furnace of his contained fury. He scowled relentlessly, his gaze, whenever the opportunity arose, burning holes into Zuko's back, a silent, impotent challenge. His spirit, bruised by the crushing weight of defeat, had not, however, been broken. The embers of his defiance still glowed red within him, promising a future conflagration. The journey across the straits was long enough for the initial shock of capture to settle, replaced by a sullen resignation in some, and a smoldering anger in others. Smellerbee, Pipsqueak, Longshot, and the Duke sat huddled together, their eyes darting between their leader and the imposing figures of the Fire Nation soldiers who stood guard, their spears held with practiced ease. Even though they were silent, a palpable current of shared dismay and stubborn hope flowed between them. Hours later, the deep green and brown of the open forest began to give way to a coastline, jagged and dark, rising sharply from the churning waves. On the horizon, a colossal shadow materialized, gradually resolving into the stark, awe-inspiring silhouette of the Poway stronghold. It rose from the formidable cliffs like a petrified giant, an anachronism of stone and fire standing sentinel over the unforgiving sea. This was no mere outpost, it was a testament to centuries of Fire Nation military might, built not just to defend, but to project an undeniable aura of intimidation. The stronghold was a formidable beast of dark, volcanic stone, meticulously carved and assembled into sheer, unscalable walls that seemed to weep directly from the rock face itself, their surfaces scarred by countless storms and the passage of time. These titanic walls were studded with a network of squat, heavily fortified towers, their battlements bristling with monstrous catapults and ballistas, their enormous arms drawn back, perpetually poised for war. Each tower was crowned with the vivid crimson and gold of Fire Nation banners, their stylized flame motifs snapping and whipping in the relentless coastal wind, symbols of a power that had endured for 100 years. Every crenellation, every arrow slit, every massive, iron-bound gate spoke of an age-old purpose: defense, subjugation, control. The fortress radiated an ancient energy, a dark, geological memory from a different era, yet it was vibrantly alive with the ceaseless thrum of military life. Even from a distance, the keen eyes of the freedom fighters could discern the ant-like figures of soldiers drilling in the parade grounds, their synchronized movements like a complex, living machine. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the low hum of activity, the distant clang of metal on metal, the sharp bark of commands carried on the wind, all converging into a symphony of martial might. Smoke curled from numerous vents and chimneys, hinting at forges and kitchens deep within its stony heart, sustaining the army it housed. As Zuko's crew drew closer, approaching the heavily fortified base carved directly into the base of the cliffs, the scene below unfolded with precise, almost theatrical formality. A reception was clearly anticipated. Lines of Fire Nation soldiers, their armor gleaming like polished obsidian under the overcast sky, stood in perfect, unyielding formation along the stone floor. Their postures were stiff, their gazes fixed straight ahead, an intimidating phalanx of discipline. A rhythmic, deep thrumming echoed across the base, the steady beat of ancestral war drums, a solemn welcome that vibrated through the very timbers of the ship and into the chests of all aboard. At the head of this stern procession stood Commander Morohiro, the base commander. He was an older man, his face etched with the deep lines of countless campaigns and the burdens of command, his grizzled features a roadmap of unwavering loyalty and stern authority. His armor was a magnificent, anachronistic display, harkening back to a grander, more ornate style of Fire Nation military regalia. A heavy, intricate breastplate, forged from darkened steel and embellished with sweeping flame motifs in gold, covered his chest. A tall, crimson-plumed helmet sat upon his head, its design reminiscent of ancient Fire Lord warriors, casting a shadow over his piercing, dark eyes. A long, heavy crimson cape, edged with black embroidery, flowed behind him, stirring subtly in the sea breeze, adding a dramatic flourish to his already imposing figure. Every movement he made, even the slight shift of his weight, was rigid with ingrained discipline, his very presence radiating an unwavering adherence to order and tradition. As Zuko, followed by Azula, stepped onto the base, Commander Morohiro executed a flawless, low bow, his armored form bending with an impressive, almost archaic grace. His voice, when he spoke, was a deep, resonant baritone, steeped in formal respect and the unwavering certainty of hierarchy. Crown Prince Zuko, Princess Azula, he began, his voice carrying clearly over the rhythmic drums and the lapping of waves. The Polway stronghold, its garrison, and its resources are entirely yours. We stand ready to execute any command, to fulfill any need, to serve the Fire Lord's children with absolute loyalty. He straightened, his gaze sweeping over them, a flicker of profound respect in his eyes. Your arrival is an immense honor to this garrison, a testament to the Fire Lord's foresight and the unbreakable traditions that bind us all. We are at your service, now and always. Zuko, his own stance regal and assured, offered a curt, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. His gaze was direct, meeting Morohairo's without a hint of wavering. He was the Crown Prince, and he expected no less. Azula, however, stood slightly to his side, her lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, a silent commentary on the general's elaborate pomp. She found such traditional displays tiresome, yet she understood their utility in maintaining the established order. She merely inclined her head, a gesture less of respect and more of condescending acceptance. Then, the focus shifted to the prisoners. The captured freedom fighters were roughly paraded down, their bound forms a stark contrast to the immaculate soldiers. A ripple of low whispers spread through the garrison ranks. The soldiers, hardened and disciplined, nevertheless couldn't help but notice the youth of the rebels. They were ragged, disheveled, their clothing torn and smeared with dirt from their recent struggle, yet there was an undeniable vibrancy in their rebellious eyes, a raw, untamed energy that suggested they were far from ordinary bandits. Their wildness, their defiance even in defeat, hinted at a formidable skill, a cunning that had allowed them to evade capture for so long. As Jet was brought directly before Commander Morohairo, a soldier, perhaps too eager to display his loyalty, roughly shoved him forward. Jet, his eyes still burning with resentment, reacted instinctively. He spat a mouthful of saliva and grime onto the pristine stone ground at the general's armored boots, a visceral act of defiance that earned him an immediate, sharp blow from the flat of a soldier's spear haft across his back. He grunted, stumbling forward, but recovered quickly, his glare never leaving his captors. Before the soldier could deliver another strike, Zuko's voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the air. Enough! His command brooked no argument. They are prisoners, not punching bags. They will not be beaten. He fixed the offending soldier with a cold, unwavering stare, then met Morohairo's gaze. I have a different use for them, Commander. One that requires them intact, not broken on the floor. Morohairo, though clearly surprised by the Crown Prince's leniency towards enemies, simply bowed his head in strict obedience. As you command, Prince Zuko. The freedom fighters were then led away, their fate a terrifying uncertainty. They were marched deep into the fortress, through a labyrinth of echoing stone corridors that seemed to swallow the light. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, carrying the damp, earthy scent of ancient rock. Eventually, they were brought to the massive prison blocks, a grim, subterranean network of cells carved directly into the very heart of the mountain. The air here was heavy, still, and despite the chill of the stone, the iron bars of the cell doors glowed with a faint, almost imperceptible heat, a constant, low-level warmth maintained by some unseen Fire Nation mechanism, perhaps to prevent rusting or simply to make the confinement more oppressive. They were all herded into a single, large cell within one wing of the prison. The heavy, iron-bound door clanged shut behind them with a resounding boom that reverberated through the rock, sealing them in their cold, silent tomb. The sparse light filtering in from a narrow, high-set slit offered little comfort. Jet, immediately restless, began to pace the confined space, his fury a palpable force. He turned to face the others, his voice a raw whisper, laced with frustrated rage. This is tyranny! This is what they do! They lock us away, they try to break us. But I won't bow to them. We won't bow to any Fire Nation tyrant. His voice rose, defiant, carrying through the stone. We will endure. We will find a way out of here. We will never surrender. A dark, imposing figure appeared at the high, grated window of the cell door, casting a long shadow into their space. It was Zuko, his face grim, his eyes like molten gold in the dim light. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost dangerously quiet, yet it cut through Jet's impassioned shouts with chilling precision. "You'll serve, Jet. Whether by choice, or by the sheer will to survive. Time will tell which path you choose." His gaze lingered for a moment, a promise and a threat intertwined, before he turned and disappeared, leading the freedom fighters to their fear and their defiance. Later that evening, in the commander's war room, a spacious chamber with maps unfurled across a heavy, polished table, and the glowing embers of a brazier casting dancing shadows, Zuko explained his unusual intent to Commander Morohiro. Azula was also present, leaning against a pillar, her arms crossed, an expression of languid disdain on her perfect features. "Commander," Zuko began, his voice authoritative, gesturing towards a schematic representation of the stronghold. "These rebels, these freedom fighters. They are not common criminals. They demonstrate a remarkable level of teamwork, a cunning born of desperation, and a discipline, however wild, that has allowed them to operate effectively against our forces for months." He paused, looking at Morohiro. "They should not be allowed to rot in these cells, a wasted asset. Instead, I propose to break them down, yes, but not to destroy them. To rebuild them." Morohiro listened with a rigid posture, his expression a mask of professional inscrutability, though a subtle furrow appeared between his grizzled brows. "They can be trained," Zuko continued, pacing with a nervous energy that belied his calm facade. "Their natural cohesion, their resourcefulness, their knowledge of the Earth Kingdom terrain, if properly disciplined, if their loyalty can be redirected, they could be forged into an elite auxiliary unit, serving under Fire Nation command." Azula, who had been listening with an air of detached amusement, finally spoke, her voice laced with a sharp, mocking cynicism. "You want to tame street rats, Zuko? You want to turn wild dogs into warhounds, just by shackling them with the Fire Nation uniform? It's a waste of resources, brother. Kill them. Or let them rot. Why bother with such experiments?" Zuko turned, his gaze meeting hers, a silent challenge passing between them. "Because, Azula, their fire, however misdirected, is still fire. Their natural cohesion, their willingness to fight for a cause, even a misguided one, can be a potent weapon. It simply needs to be refined, pointed in the correct direction." He turned back to Morohiro. "With the right training, the right environment, and, yes, the right discipline, their unique skills could be invaluable. They will not be Earth Kingdom rebels anymore. They will be Fire Nation assets." Commander Morohiro, a man whose entire life had been predicated on the unyielding tenets of Fire Nation tradition, expressed his doubt, his voice respectful but firm. "Prince Zuko, with all due respect, our warriors are forged in the crucible of Fire Nation tradition. Their discipline is ingrained from birth, their loyalty absolute. These forest dwellers, they learned their tactics in Earth Kingdom forests, not Fire Nation academies. Their very nature is antithetical to our order. To trust them, to train them, it goes against everything we know." Zuko held his gaze, his determination solidifying. "Tradition has its place, Commander. But sometimes, pragmatism must guide us. I am not asking for your trust in them immediately. With my authority as the Crown Prince of the Fire Nation and the future Fire Lord, I am commanding you to provide the means for their transformation. They are my prisoners, and this is my directive." Morohiro hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The Crown Prince's word was law, even if his methods were unconventional. With a deep sigh that was barely audible, he bowed, his crimson plume swaying. "If the Crown Prince wills it, then it shall be done. They will be broken," he added, his voice hardening, reflecting his own unshakable belief in the rigor of Fire Nation training, "or they will serve, Prince Zuko. One way or another." Deep within the cold, echoing heart of the Poway stronghold, the freedom fighters huddled together in their cell, the faint glow of the heated bars doing little to dispel the chill of their surroundings or the dread in their hearts. Jet, despite the crushing weight of their defeat, leaned in close to his comrades, his eyes blazing with a defiant, unwavering fire. "Listen to me," he whispered, his voice hoarse, they think they've won. They think they can break us. But we won't let them. We're freedom fighters. We will endure this. We will find a way out. We have to. We'll escape, remember what we fought for, and we'll get back at them. But even as he spoke, a shadow of doubt, cold and creeping, seemed to cling to the edges of his words, a silent fear that their once unshakable resolve might, indeed, begin to fray. Above them, within the stark grandeur of his temporary chambers, Zuko stood by a high, arched window, gazing out at the vast, intimidating expanse of the Fire Nation fortress, its dark stone bathed in the pale moonlight. His mind was not on the battlements, nor the sea, but on the caged rebels below. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched his lips, a rare expression of satisfaction mixed with a ruthless certainty. No, Jet, he thought, his gaze distant, calculating. You'll learn. You'll be mine. Chapter 69, The Omens of Mount Makapu. The immense, iron-bound gates of Poway's stronghold closed behind them with a final, thunderous boom, sealing the freedom fighters and Commander Moroharo's doubts within its stony heart. The humid, oppressive air of the swamp was replaced by the crisp, clean scent of pine and highland earth. Zuko led his column, Azula, Rin, Lee, and the remaining soldiers away from the sea cliffs and back into the sprawling embrace of the Earth Kingdom's interior. Their pace was relentless, a forced march driven by Zuko's simmering urgency. The brief detour to the fortress had been necessary to secure the prisoners, but it was a delay nonetheless. The Avatar was moving, always moving, and every day spent not pursuing him felt like a lifetime. They trekked for days, following game trails and dry riverbeds that cut through the forested foothills. The terrain began to change, the gentle slopes gradually rising into steeper, rockier passes. The air grew thinner and carried a new, faint scent that made Rin's nose wrinkle. Sulfur, he grunted, adjusting the strap of his pack. Smells like a forge. Or rotten eggs. Lee, consulting a worn map he had procured from the stronghold's archives, nodded. Geologically consistent. These mountains are volcanic. Dormant, according to this, but the vents still breathe. He pointed ahead to a plume of wispy white smoke rising from a distant peak. That is likely the source. There should be a village in its shadow. Makapu. It is the only settlement marked on this route for 2 days' march. An ideal point for resupply. Volcano or not, if they have a market, they have food that isn't travel rations, Rin said, the thought alone quickening his step. Azula, who had been walking in silence, her expression one of profound boredom, finally spoke. Let's hope their taste in entertainment is better than their air quality. I require something more stimulating than watching you two discuss geology and groceries. By the next afternoon, they crested a final ridge and looked down into the wide, fertile caldera of the dormant volcano. Nestled within it was the village of Makapu, its stone houses and vibrant green fields a stark contrast to the dark, volcanic soil. It was quiet, but not peacefully so. An unusual tension hung in the air, a feeling of hushed expectation. As they descended into the village, the reason became clear. The place was not deserted, it was mesmerized. The villagers moved with a purpose, but it was a quiet, reverent one. Their chatter was low, their glances consistently drifting toward a large, well-kept hut at the village's center, where a long, patient line of people had gathered. Zuko's hand instinctively went to the hood of his travel-worn cloak, pulling it lower to shadow his scar. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice tight with suspicion. "An assembly? A conscription?" Rin, ever direct, stepped into the path of a young man carrying a basket of sweet-smelling buns. "You! What's happening? Why is everyone gathered like sheep?" The young man blinked, startled by the gruff tone, but his face quickly broke into an excited grin. "Travelers? You've come at a wonderful time. Aunt Wu is here. She's granting audiences today, reading the fates." "A fortune-teller?" Azula's voice tripped with such pure, undiluted scorn that the young man flinched. She looked around at the simple huts and hopeful faces as if she had discovered a new species of insect. This is what passes for culture. You line up to have your ears filled with comforting lies? The villager puffed out his chest, defensive. Aunt Wu is never wrong. She predicted the rains would come last week to water our fields, and they did. She knows all. Before Azula could eviscerate him with a reply, Li interjected, his analytical mind seizing on the information. A single figure who commands this level of influence, she dictates the mood and actions of the entire village. She is the de facto leader. This is a prime intelligence opportunity. Zuko said nothing. His initial impulse was to agree with Azula, to dismiss this as peasant superstition and demand directions to a proper inn or merchant. But Li's assessment was coldly logical. And another, older impulse stirred within him, the desperate, 3-year-long gamble that had him chasing whispers and legends across the globe. The Avatar was a myth to most, yet he was real. What was one more myth? His eyes, narrowed and calculating, scanned the line of believers, the mysterious hut. Somewhere in this vast kingdom, the Avatar was hiding. Perhaps the path wasn't just through force and tracking. Perhaps it was through any means, any omen, no matter how foolish it seemed. A decision, reckless and born of desperation, was made. Li is correct, Zuko stated, his voice low and final. This Aunt Wu is a resource. We will see what she knows. He adjusted his cloak, ensuring his features were well hidden. We'll get in line. Azula stared at him, her perfect composure cracking for a fraction of a second into genuine disbelief. You cannot be serious. I am never anything but serious, Zuko replied, his golden eyes glinting from the depths of his hood. He turned and took a single step toward the end of the line before stopping abruptly. He glanced back at Azula, his expression unreadable. You. Wait here. Guard our position. The last thing we need is your commentary, scaring off the locals. Azula's eyes narrowed into slits, a silent promise of retribution flashing within them. But the order, framed as a tactical necessity, was one she could not openly refuse without causing the very scene she despised. She leaned against the wall of a nearby shed with an exaggerated sigh of boredom, radiating an aura of lethal indifference. Zuko didn't wait for her compliance. He turned to Rin and Li, his gaze sharp. You too. With me. Now. The command brooked no argument. He didn't lead them toward the line, but instead veered sharply into a narrow, dank alleyway between two stone houses, well out of earshot of the main thoroughfare and, most importantly, Azula. The alley was shadowed and cool, smelling of damp earth and old vegetables. The cheerful murmur of the crowd was muffled, replaced by the tense silence between the three men. Rin and Li followed, confusion on their faces, assuming their prince had some swift, tactical briefing. Zuko turned to face them, his back to the alley's entrance, blocking the light. He didn't speak immediately, letting the weight of the isolated space press down on them. His hood was still up, casting his scarred face in deep shadow, making his glowing amber eyes the most visible feature, sharp and unnerving. Sir? Li prompted, his voice cautious. What are your orders regarding the fortune-teller? Should we prepare specific questions to? You know, Zuko interrupted, his voice a low, quiet thing that was far more threatening than a shout. It was utterly flat, devoid of all emotion, and it froze the words in Li's throat. Don't you? Rin's confused frown deepened. No what, my prince? No, what about the village? Not about the village, Zuko said, his eyes flicking between them, missing nothing. You know what happened. That night before the ambush. In the forest, before we reached Poway. Don't you remember your little conversation? A different, deeper silence descended. Rin's face went carefully, professionally blank. Li's breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. It was all the confirmation Zuko needed. Li, ever the analyst, tried to navigate the minefield. Prince Zuko, the events of the ambush and our subsequent victory were. Don't, Zuko snarled, the first crack in his icy control, a flicker of raw fire in his eyes. Do not insult me by pretending to misunderstand. You know. I see it in the way you look at me. In the way you look at her. The careful silence you keep when we are all together. You were on watch that night on the Crescent Island. You saw Rin, whose loyalty was built on blunt honesty rather than intellectual evasion, finally broke. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he let out a long, slow breath, the sound loud in the confined space. He looked at the ground, then back at his prince, his gaze steady but filled with a profound, uncomfortable respect. We didn't see anything, Prince Zuko. We heard enough. The admission hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Li found his voice again, his tone hushed, urgent. It is not our place to know, sir. It is not our place to speak of it. We are your men. Our loyalty is to you. Our duty is to forget what we inferred. Forget? Zuko took a half step forward, and though he was not firebending, the heat seemed to radiate from him. Do you think I care about your gossip? Do you think I care about your judgment? The questions were laced with a venom that was as much self-directed as it was aimed at them. I brought you in here to ask you one question, and you will answer with the truth. Do you understand the consequences if this ever leaves the confines of your own minds? The threat was absolute, colder than the mountain air. Rin answered first, his voice a gravelly whisper. On my life, my prince. It is already forgotten. It was a moment of exhaustion. Of battle frenzy. It means nothing. He was trying to give them both an out, to frame it as something that could be dismissed. Li nodded sharply, his mind already categorizing the information as a top secret to be sealed away forever. It is a non-factor. A statistical anomaly with no bearing on our mission parameters or our loyalty. You have our absolute discretion, Prince Zuko. You have my word as a strategist and Rin's as your soldier. Zuko studied them for a long, agonizing moment, his eyes searching theirs for any hint of deceit, any flicker of mockery. He saw only fear, unwavering loyalty, and a desperate desire to never speak of this again. It was the best he could hope for. Good, he said, the fire in his eyes receding, replaced by the familiar, hardened resolve. Then it is never mentioned again. By anyone. To anyone. Especially not to her. He didn't need to specify who her was. What happened in that forest is dead. You will bury it. Chapter 70, The Reflection in the Smoke. The line to Aunt Wu's hut was a slow-moving river of quiet hope and simmering anxiety. Zuko stood within it, a dark, rigid rock disrupting the flow. Rin and Li flanked him, their postures stiff, their eyes carefully avoiding their prince and each other. The tense, confessional silence from the alleyway clung to them like a shroud, making the cheerful murmur of the villagers feel alien and intrusive. Zuko's hood was pulled low, casting his scarred face in deep shadow, but his golden eyes missed nothing. He watched the villagers, a young woman clutching a locket, an old farmer worrying over his dried-out fields, a mother with a sick child in her arms. Their faces were etched with a vulnerability that was both fascinating and repulsive to him. This was not the strength of fire and steel, it was the fragile strength of belief, and he found it dangerously unpredictable. Rin shifted his weight, the armor under his tunic creaking softly. The blunt, honest soldier was out of his element. He'd rather face a full Earth Kingdom battalion than this silent, emotional queue. His gaze kept flicking to Zuko's back, remembering the cold fire in the prince's eyes in the alley, the unspoken threat that now lay between them. He had seen battles, but he had never felt a fear so personal. Li, conversely, was analyzing. His sharp eyes catalogued the hut's construction, the demographics of the crowd, the average time per audience. He was trying to reduce the mysticism to data, a comfortable framework of facts and figures. But even his analytical mind couldn't fully dismiss the palpable energy of the place, the absolute faith these people had in the woman behind the curtain. It was a powerful tool, he noted. Perhaps the most powerful one in the village. From her post by the shed, Azula watched the trio with a look of profound, theatrical boredom. She examined her nails, then the clouds, then the simple thatch roofs of the huts, her expression suggesting she was being forced to witness the intellectual decline of her species. Yet, beneath the disdain, her mind was working. She saw how the villagers gave the hut a wide berth, the reverence in their glances. This Aunt Wu wasn't just a fortune-teller, she was the central pillar of this community's morale. A pillar, Azula mused, that would be so very easy to kick out. A few well-placed words about inaccurate predictions, a staged bad omen, it would be a delightful little experiment in social manipulation. She filed the thought away for future amusement. Finally, after an eternity of waiting, it was their turn. A young acolyte, a girl with serious eyes, held aside the beaded curtain for them. Rin and Li moved to follow Zuko in, but the girl shook her head gently. Aunt Wu sees only one at a time. The spirits speak for one audience only. Zuko didn't look back. Wait here, he commanded, his voice a low growl from the depths of his hood. He stepped inside, and the curtain fell shut, leaving Rin and Li standing guard, two statues of military discipline in a sea of soft superstition. The interior of the hut was a world apart. The air was thick and sweet with the scent of burning sage and exotic incense, smoke curling in lazy blue-gray tendrils towards the ceiling. The only light came from a single, low brazier in the center of the room and a few fat, guttering candles, their flames casting dancing shadows on tapestries depicting celestial charts and mythical beasts. It was warm, close, and unnervingly quiet. Aunt Wu sat on a raised dais on the other side of the brazier, a woman of indeterminate age with long, silver-streaked hair and a face that was both kind and immeasurably ancient. She did not look up as he entered, her attention seemingly absorbed by a scattering of smooth, dark stones arranged on a low table before her. "Sit, traveler from a land of fire and industry," she said, her voice a soft, melodic rasp, like wind over dry leaves. She still hadn't looked at him. Every instinct in Zuko screamed that this was a performance, a trick designed to unbalance the gullible. He remained standing, his arms crossed. "I am not here for pleasantries or peasant superstition," he stated, his tone cutting through the smoky atmosphere. "You will tell me what you know of the Avatar." At that, Aunt Wu did look up. Her eyes were a surprising, clear gray, and they held no fear, only a deep, penetrating curiosity. They swept over his cloaked form, not with the fear of a villager seeing a soldier, but with the focus of a scholar examining a rare text. "The Avatar is a thread in a great tapestry," she said calmly, gesturing to the stones. "A bright, shifting thread, difficult to follow. But you are a tear in the fabric. A patch of something other." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intensifying. "You hide your face, son of fire, but you cannot hide your conflict. It radiates from you. It screams." Zuko felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Victor. She was seeing Victor. He forced his voice to remain steady, authoritative. "You will answer the question I paid you to answer. Where is the Avatar?" Aunt Wu smiled faintly, a knowing, infuriating expression. "The world answers not to demands, but to questions. Yours is the wrong one." She reached out and traced a pattern in the air above the brazier, the smoke swirling in response. "You seek the one who is too. Master of all, servant of all. Look not to the living earth, but to the bones of the dead. Look for the mountain that breathes but does not live, where the past and present meet under a sky of ash." Zuko's mind, trained for tactical advantage, seized on the clue. A mountain that breathes, a volcano. Sky of ash. The Northern Air Temple. It was a specific, viable location. It was exactly what he needed. A part of him wanted to turn and leave immediately, his objective achieved. But Aunt Wu was not finished. Her voice dropped, losing its performative quality and becoming stark, serious. "Your path is written in the soot of a forgotten temple. But that is the simplest of truths I see for you." Her gray eyes locked with his, and he felt a bizarre sensation, as if she were looking not at him, but through him, into the very core of the consciousness that called itself Zuko. "You wear a face that is both yours and not," she whispered, the words seeming to slither from the smoke itself. You are a river with two sources, a spirit caught between two worlds, flowing in a bed not carved for it. The fire you command is yours, yet the hands that guide it are borrowed. You dream in a tongue you cannot speak upon waking. Zuko's blood ran cold. His hand twitched, a spark of fire instinctively igniting at his fingertip before he brutally suppressed it. How? This was impossible. This was a peasant woman in a backwater village. She was guessing, fishing for a reaction. She had to be. But her next words struck with the precision of a knife thrower. You fear the woman with your eyes, she said, her gaze unwavering. The sharp, cruel mirror. You are right too. She is the stone that will shatter the reflection, or the reflection that will shatter the stone. Your destinies are locked in a dance, and one of you will not leave the floor. Azula. She was talking about Azula. The cold in his stomach turned to ice. Your greatest victory will taste of ash, she continued, her voice almost pitying now. And the throne you believe you crave, it will be a gilded cage, colder than any prison, unless you can unite the two spirits warring within you. The prince and the phantom. Only then will you find not just power, but peace. Silence descended, thick and heavy. The only sound was the soft hiss of the brazier. The clues about the Avatar were forgotten, buried under a landslide of existential dread. She knew. She knew. With a movement that felt jerky, unnatural, Zuko reached into his cloak and pulled out a heavy purse of gold coins. He didn't offer it, he threw it onto the floor at the edge of her dais. The clatter of metal on wood was violently loud in the quiet hut. For your performance, he snarled, his voice hoarse with a mixture of fury and naked fear. He turned on his heel, the smoky air suddenly feeling suffocating. He needed to be out. Now. He burst through the beaded curtain, the strands clacking together violently behind him. Rin and Lee snapped to attention, their questions dying on their lips as they saw his face. He was pale beneath his hood, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. His eyes, usually burning with focused intensity, were wide, shaken, like a man who had just stared into an abyss and seen it stare back. We're leaving, he bit out, the command leaving no room for argument. He strode forward, not looking back at the hut, as if physically fleeing the words that had been spoken within. Azula pushed herself off the shed wall, her smirk returning full force. Well? Did the old hag promise you a pretty girlfriend and a long life? She mocked, falling into step beside him. You look like you've seen a ghost, Zuzu. Was her crystal ball that cloudy? Zuko didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He just kept walking, his pace quickening, his mind a roaring tumult of fire and fear. A spirit between worlds. The woman with your eyes. The stone and the reflection. He had the Avatar's location. He had what he wanted. But as he led his group out of Makapu village without a backward glance, he felt a terrifying certainty that Aunt Wu had given him something else entirely, a glimpse of his own end, and the chilling knowledge that his greatest enemy might not be the Avatar, or Azula, but the fractured soul within his own skin. Chapter 71, The Festival of a False Sun. The crisp, thin air of the highlands gave way to the warmer, wood-smoke-scented breezes of the valley. For 3 days they had marched, a silent and tense procession. Zuko led from the front, a brooding statue astride his Komodo rhino, his gaze fixed on the horizon where a distant, smoldering peak met the sky. The clue from the fortune-teller echoed in his mind, a relentless mantra. The mountain that breathes. The soot of a forgotten temple. It was a direction, a purpose, and it was the only thing holding the shattered pieces of his composure together. Behind him, the silence was a physical weight. Rin and Lee maintained a respectful, and increasingly fearful, distance. Their prince had not spoken a word to them beyond necessary commands since leaving Makapu. The confrontation in the alley was a specter that walked between them. They had heard things that could get them killed, things that had fundamentally altered their perception of the royal family, of their prince, of everything. The memory of those sounds, the raw, unrestrained passion followed by the chilling, violent aftermath, was burned into their minds. They looked at Zuko's rigid back and did not see just a commander, they saw a man of terrifying contradictions, a prince who could unleash dragon fire one moment and commit an act of profound, taboo passion the next. Their loyalty was absolute, but it was now alloyed with a new, profound wariness. Azula, for her part, seemed to be enjoying the atmosphere of strained silence. She observed the dynamic with the keen eye of a viper watching mice freeze in its presence. She knew something had transpired between her brother and his men, something that had them walking on knives. It amused her. It was Lee who first noticed the change in the air. He sniffed, his analytical mind sorting through the scents on the wind. Smoke. But not forged smoke. Cook fires. Many of them. And music? They crested a final hill, and the source of the sounds and smells was laid out before them in a wide, fertile river valley. It was a large Fire Nation colony town, a mix of Earth Kingdom stone foundations and the sweeping, pitched roofs and crimson banners of the Fire Nation. But today, the town was not a military outpost, it was a riot of color and noise. The streets were packed with people, both colonists and what appeared to be contented Earth Kingdom locals. Paper lanterns in 1,000 shades of red, orange, and gold were strung between buildings, fluttering in the breeze. The air thrummed with the beat of drums, the lively pluck of pipas, and the joyful shouts of celebration. Stalls lined the streets, selling steaming buns, candied fruits, and spiced kebabs. It was a festival. A festival? Ring grunted, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of his Dao sword. What in Agni's name are they celebrating? As Zuko's column began its descent toward the main gate, a change rippled through the crowd nearest the outskirts. The music didn't stop, but it faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence. The joyful noise was replaced by a wave of murmuring that swept through the town like a wind through grass. Eyes turned toward the hill, toward the armored soldiers and the proud, banner-flying standard of the Crown Prince. Then, a single voice, clear and loud, cut through the murmur. "The Prince! It is him! It is Prince Zuko!" The effect was instantaneous. The uncertainty shattered, replaced by a roaring, deafening wave of adulation. The crowd didn't just part, it surged forward, not in fear, but in welcome. People rushed to the sides of the road, bowing deeply, many dropping to their knees. Children were hoisted onto shoulders to see. The music swelled again, this time in a triumphant, heroic rhythm. Zuko reined in his mount, his expression hidden beneath his helmet, but his body was rigid with surprise. This was not the reception he was accustomed to. He was used to fear, to hatred, to grudging respect from his soldiers. This was something else entirely. A portly man in the rich, formal robes of a colonial magistrate, his face flushed with excitement and panic, waddled forward, flanked by town guards who were struggling to hold back the ecstatic crowd. "Prince Zuko," the magistrate cried, bowing so low his forehead nearly scraped the dusty ground. "Your Highness! This is an honor beyond words. We had no word of your visit. Forgive the disorganization. We are not prepared to receive the Dragon of Nanhai with the proper ceremony." The title hit Zuko like a physical blow. The Dragon of Nanhai. The name he had earned after he had vaporized an Earth Kingdom fleet and part of the ocean itself. The name that had been whispered after he had single-handedly defeated General Fong, the Earth Kingdom's so-called invincible general, reducing his fortress to a smoldering crater. The propaganda machine had been busy. They had taken his most destructive, rage-fueled moments and spun them into legends. They had made him a hero. Azula urged her mount forward, coming alongside Zuko. Her voice was a low, silken murmur meant only for his ears. "It seems you have a fan club, brother. How quaint. Try not to let it go to your head. Popularity is a fickle thing." Zuko ignored her. He dismounted, his movements stiff. The magistrate practically groveled at his feet. "Your Highness, you arrive on the most auspicious of days. Our annual Sun Festival. It is to celebrate Agni's warmth and the prosperity he brings our colony. But now, it shall be in your honor." A celebration of your glorious victories for the Fire Nation. The crowd roared its approval. Petals of fire lilies were thrown into the air, raining down around them in a fragrant, crimson shower. Zuko felt a hand tugging at his own. A little girl, no older than 6, her eyes wide with awe, pressed a clumsily made crown of woven flame orchids into his gauntlet hand before her mother quickly pulled her back, bowing apologetically. This was not for the banished prince. This was for a myth. For the dragon. For the conqueror. Victor Crane's soul recoiled at the blind adulation given for acts of horrific violence. But Prince Zuko! Prince Zuko stood a little taller. The part of him that was still a boy, that still craved his father's approval and his nation's respect, thawed slightly in the warmth of their cheers. It was a dangerous, seductive feeling. "Rise," Zuko commanded, his voice carrying over the noise with a natural, royal authority that silenced the crowd. The magistrate scrambled to his feet. "We require rest and resupply," Zuko stated. "My men are tired." Of course, Your Highness. Everything we have is yours," the magistrate gushed. "Please, allow us to provide a procession. Let the people see their hero." And so they were swept into the town. It was less a march and more a river of humanity carrying them along. Soldiers who had been prepared for a fight now found themselves accepting cups of wine and handfuls of sweets from grateful civilians. Rin and Lee stayed close to Zuko, their faces masks of professional duty, but their eyes were wide with the surrealism of it all. They were used to being occupiers, viewed with suspicion. This open-armed celebration was disorienting. Zuko walked, the flower crown still clutched in his hand, his golden eyes scanning the scene. He saw the genuine joy, the pride on their faces. They believed in the war. They believed in him. His gaze drifted over the crowd, over the festival stalls, over the notices pinned to a public board. And then he stopped. Amid notices of market prices and town ordinances was a series of wanted posters. One, crudely drawn, depicted a young boy with arrows on his head and a goofy smile. The Avatar. Another showed a water tribe girl. A third, a boy with a boomerang. But it was the fourth poster that made the air leave his lungs. It was older, slightly faded. The face on it was stern, severe, with a soldier's haircut and deep-set, weary eyes. The script beneath it was clear, wanted for treason and desertion. Zhong Zhong. Former Admiral of the Fire Navy. Reward for capture, 10,000 gold pieces. Recognition, cold and absolute, slammed into Victor Crane's mind. Zhong Zhong. The deserter. This was the village. This was the festival. This was the exact episode. Aang was here, or he would be. They would meet Zhong Zhong in the forests beyond this town. The knowledge was so visceral, so out of place, that for a moment he felt dizzy. He was living inside a memory from a life spent watching a cartoon on a screen. The dissonance was staggering. The magistrate followed his gaze. "Ah, a sorry business, Your Highness. The traitor Zhong Zhong. We believe he hides in the surrounding forests, like a rat. We mount patrols, but he is a cunning old fox. He was once a great firebender, they say." "A shame." Zuko said nothing. His mind raced. Zhong Zhong. The first firebender to leave the army. A master of control, of discipline. The man who could teach Aang to firebend without burning the world down. The man who understood the destructive nature of fire better than anyone. Should he find him? What would he even say? Could he learn from him? The idea was treasonous. Zhong Zhong was a criminal. But he was also perhaps the only person in the world who could understand the dual nature of fire, the balance between the destructive force the Fire Nation worshipped and the life-giving energy it could be. The same duality he felt warring within himself. His thoughts were interrupted by the procession arriving at the town's central square. A large stage had been erected, and the magistrate was ushering him toward it. "A speech, Your Highness. Please, bless us with a few words." Zuko was pushed onto the stage, facing a sea of hopeful, fervent faces. Rin and Lee took positions at the base of the stage, their discomfort palpable. They were close enough to see the tension in his posture, the conflict in his eyes that the crowd mistook for noble intensity. Zuko looked out at them, these people celebrating a festival of light while he was haunted by shadows. He held up the flower crown. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the wisdom of their dragon prince. Fire. He began, his voice rough, then stronger. Fire is life. It is energy. It is purpose. He was parroting Fire Nation dogma, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. He thought of Zhang Zhang's wanted poster. He thought of the uncontrollable inferno he had become against Jet. He thought of the cool, controlled blue of Azula's flames. But it must be controlled. Without control, it is only destruction. The crowd cheered, misunderstanding his meaning entirely. They heard a warning to their enemies. They did not hear a prince warning himself. He handed the crown back to the little girl in the front row, who beamed as if he had given her a chest of gold. The celebration erupted again, louder than before. As he stepped off the platform, the magistrate approached, bowing. "We have prepared the former governor's manor for you and your retinue, Prince Zuko. A feast is being prepared in your honor." Zuko gave a curt nod. His eyes met Rin's and Lee's for a fraction of a second. The fear in their eyes was now mixed with a dawning confusion. They had heard the subtle tremor in his voice, seen the distant look in his eye. Their prince, who had just been celebrated as a conquering hero, had never looked more lost. And as the sun began to set, setting the paper lanterns ablaze with light, creating a false, beautiful sun over the happy town, Zuko made a decision. He would not wait for Aang to find Zhang Zhang. He would find him first. Chapter 72, The Tile and the Lotus. The feast in the governor's manor was a lavish, noisy affair. Platters of roasted Komodo chicken glazed with fire honey, steaming bowls of noodle soup, and delicate pastries shaped like dancing dragons circulated the great hall. Fire Nation nobles and colonial officials vied for a moment of the crown prince's attention, their laughter too loud, their compliments too thick. Zuko sat at the head of the table, a statue of forced composure. He ate little, his golden eyes scanning the room, not for threats of the assassin variety, but for something far more subtle. Azula held court at his right, holding a glass of wine with elegant disdain. She was a queen observing her subjects, offering sharp, witty remarks that kept the sycophants at a careful distance. She noticed her brother's distraction. "Not enjoying your hero's welcome, Zuzu? One would think you'd be basking in it. It's so rare you get to be the center of positive attention." Zuko ignored the barb. His focus was absolute. The wanted poster of Zhang Zhang was a ghost haunting the periphery of his vision. He had to find a way into the forests, a way to find the deserter without alerting the entire garrison. And Victor Crane knew the key. The Order of the White Lotus. And the key to the order was Pai Sho. He remembered Iroha's long afternoons on the ship, the smell of jasmine tea, the gentle clack of tiles on the wooden board. His uncle's jovial explanations, his love for the game's ancient and noble strategies. And he remembered, with the strange clarity of a memory viewed from outside himself, the specific, deliberate patterns Iroha would use when he suspected a fellow traveler. It was a language within a game. Excusing himself from the table with a grunt about needing air, Zuko walked out onto a spacious veranda that overlooked the town square. The festival was still in full swing, a river of light and sound. His eyes, sharpened by a lifetime of hunting and a new, desperate purpose, scanned the crowds. And there, in a quieter corner under the gentle glow of a paper lantern, he found what he was looking for. An old man sat alone at a small stone table, a Pai Sho board set before him. He was the picture of mundane tranquility. His robes were simple, his posture relaxed. He seemed to be merely enjoying the evening air, moving tiles and a solitary game. He was utterly ordinary, which to Zuko's newly suspicious mind, made him extraordinary. Zuko approached slowly, his boots silent on the polished veranda wood. He stopped a few feet from the table, observing. The man did not look up, his gnarled fingers hovering over a white lotus tile. A solitary game is a conversation with only one mind, Zuko said, his voice low, cutting through the distant festival music. It lacks the element of surprise. The old man's hand paused. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were a watery brown, framed by a network of deep wrinkles. They held a patient, gentle curiosity, but Zuko, looking closer, saw a sharpness deep within them, a watchfulness that belied his benign appearance. A conversation can be enlightening, even with oneself, young master, the man replied, his voice a soft, rasping whisper. But you are correct. The true beauty of the game lies in the meeting of two strategies. Would you care for a match? Zuko gave a single, curt nod. He took the seat opposite the old man, the stone cool even through his armor. The board between them was a field of potential, each carved tile a soldier in a silent war. I am called Lee, the old man said, offering a slight, respectful bow of his head. You know who I am, Zuko responded, his tone not quite hostile, but guarded, testing. He did not return the bow. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the old man's lips. Of course. Forgive an old man's forgetfulness. He gestured to the board. The guest has the honor of the first move. Zuko did not hesitate. His movements were not those of a leisurely player. He reached out and placed his first tile with a decisive clack. It was not an aggressive opening. It was a specific one. He placed a white lotus tile in the center of the board, a move Iroh had once told him was about opening oneself to the universe, but which Victor knew was a signal, a question cast into the void. The old man, Lee, looked at the tile. His expression did not change, but the air between them seemed to still. The sounds of the festival faded into a dull roar. He reached into his tile box and, after a moment's consideration, placed a tile of his own. It was not a direct counter. It was a knight, placed in a defensive position that also, subtly, protected the lotus. A bold opening, Lee murmured, his eyes on the board. To place such a vulnerable piece in the center. It suggests either great confidence, or a desire to be seen. Zuko moved another piece, a chrysanthemum, positioning it to offer a narrow path toward his lotus. Some pieces are only vulnerable if they are alone. A flower that blooms unseen has no purpose. Lee's eyes flicked up to Zuko's face for a fraction of a second before returning to the board. He moved a rock, a sturdy, unassuming piece. Yet a flower that blooms too openly risks being plucked. The wind carries many scents, not all of them friendly. The game continued, move after move. To any observer, it was a quiet match between a noble youth and an elderly scholar. But beneath the surface, a second, far more dangerous game was being played. Each placement of a tile was a word. Each strategic formation was a sentence. Zuko shifted his lotus tile one space to the east, a minute adjustment. I find myself interested in rare blooms. Those that grow in unexpected places. In harsh climates. He paused, letting the implication hang. They must be resilient. They must know how to survive unseen. Lee captured a minor tile of Zuko's with a gentle tap of his rock. The strongest roots are often hidden deep beneath the soil. They draw sustenance from secret sources. To dig for them is a delicate operation. The gardener risks damaging the very thing he seeks. Zuko felt a thrill run through him. This was it. He was close. He advanced his chrysanthemum, threatening Lee's rock. Perhaps the gardener does not wish to dig. Perhaps he only wishes to know the flower is there. To know it is safe. That it is not forgotten. Lee did not immediately respond. He studied the board with an intense focus that had nothing to do with the game. He moved his knight, not to defend his rock, but to a position that created a new, fragile link between his own pieces and Zuko's advanced chrysanthemum. It was a move of tentative connection. A flower that wishes not to be forgotten must sometimes risk a bee, Lee said softly, his voice barely audible. But the bee must be careful. Its buzz can attract predators. The wrong bee can bring a storm that destroys the garden entire. Zuko understood the warning. I know what you are asking. But you are the crown prince. Your presence is a hurricane. Trust is not given lightly. He needed to offer something, to prove his intent was not destructive. He made a move that was, by conventional strategy, a mistake. He sacrificed his chrysanthemum, allowing Lise to take it. It was an offering. A show of vulnerability. Some bees, Zuko said, his voice dropping to match Li's whisper, are tired of the hive. They seek a different kind of nectar. A purer source. The capture of the tile seemed to decide something for the old man. He slowly gathered the one piece, his fingers lingering on it. He looked up, and this time, his gaze was direct, unblinking. The gentle scholar was gone, replaced by a man assessing a risk of monumental proportions. The forest to the north of the town, Li said, his words measured, each one chosen with immense care. The old riverbed, the one that dried up 2 summers ago. If one were to follow it at dawn, when the mist still clings to the bamboo, one might find interesting flora. But the path is treacherous. It is easy for a traveler to become lost. To fall. It was a direction. A specific, hidden location. Zhong's camp. Zuko held the old man's gaze. The unspoken understanding was absolute. He nodded once, a sharp, minute dip of his chin. The game was over. The conversation was finished. Zuko stood up abruptly. An enlightening game, he said, his voice returning to its normal, imperial tone for the benefit of any potential eavesdroppers. The old man, Li, began to reset the board, his head bowed once more, the picture of harmless old age. The board is a world in miniature, young master. It is always enlightening for those who know how to look. Safe travels. Zuko turned and walked back into the roar of the feast, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had done it. Using the ghost of his uncle's teachings and the knowledge of a man from another world, he had found a path. He had spoken a language of rebellion and found an answer. He had a destination. At dawn, he would follow a dried riverbed into the mist. And he would find the deserter, Zhong. Chapter 73, The Razor's Edge. The first light of dawn was a pale, gray smear in the eastern sky when Zuko slipped from the governor's manor. The festivities of the previous night had bled into the early hours, leaving the colonial town in a deep, wine-soaked slumber. Silence lay heavy over the streets, a stark contrast to the roaring adulation that had filled them just hours before. He moved like a phantom through the sleeping settlement, a solitary figure in armor the color of dried blood, his breath misting in the chill air. He left no orders for Rin and Li. The unspoken tension that had crackled between them since Makapu was a wall he had no desire to scale. Their loyalty was now a brittle, careful thing, and this mission required a certainty they could not provide. Azula, he knew, would be watching, but her amusement at his superstitious folly would keep her from following, for now. She would assume he was chasing shadows, a thought that brought a grim twist to his lips. He was chasing shadows, the shadow of a memory from another life. The old man's directions were precise. The old riverbed, the one that dried up 2 summers ago. He found it on the northern edge of the town, a deep, gash-like scar in the earth, its bottom choked with brittle, gray reeds and smooth, water-worn stones. It was a path that spoke of absence, of life that had moved on. It felt appropriate. As he descended into the riverbed, the world changed. The sounds of the waking town faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the tall, slender bamboo that clustered along the banks. And then, the mist came. Just as the old pie show player had said it would. It rolled down from the higher hills in thick, spectral waves, clinging to the bamboo groves, swallowing the light and sound, turning the forest into a ghost world. The air grew damp and cold, each breath tasting of wet earth and decaying leaves. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The world narrowed to the next step, the next gnarled root, the next skeletal branch that loomed suddenly out of the gloom. Victor Crane's memory was a flickering guide. He recalled the episode, Aang, Katara, and Sokka, led by the nervous deserter Che, trudging through a forest much like this one. He remembered the tension, the fear of Fire Nation patrols. Now, he was the patrol. He was the fear. The irony was not lost on him. He walked for what felt like hours, his senses stretched to their limit. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, was a potential threat. He was a prince of the most powerful nation in the world, walking alone into the territory of its most wanted traitors, armed only with a cryptic message from a stranger and the fractured knowledge of a television show. It was the most reckless thing he had ever done, and that was saying something. Then, he saw it. A sign. Faint, but there. A section of bamboo on the riverbank had been cut, not with the clean slice of a dowel blade, but with a precise, controlled burn. The ends were blackened and sealed, the work of a firebender who used his element not just for destruction, but for utility. Further on, a pattern of stones had been arranged near a fork in the dry riverbed. It looked natural, accidental, but to eye trained by Iroh and a mind haunted by Victor's memories, it looked like a marker. He was on the right path. The ambush came not with a roar, but with a tense, dead silence. One moment he was alone in the mist. The next, figures materialized from behind the thick bamboo trunks, from the fog itself. They were a ragged, hardened group of 8 men, their clothing a patchwork of stolen Earth Kingdom greens and worn-out Fire Nation uniforms with all insignia hastily torn away. Their faces were gaunt, etched with the perpetual weariness of men who had been running for a long time. They held a motley assortment of weapons, spears, clubs, a few swords. But their stances, their formation, it was military. These were not bandits. They were soldiers. Deserters. Their leader stepped forward. He was a wiry man with a nervous tick in his jaw, his eyes darting, forever scanning for threats. He held a notched broadsword, its point steady and aimed at Zuko's heart. "That's far enough, Fire Nation," the man hissed, his voice low and tight with anxiety. "You've walked right into your grave." Zuko stopped, his hands held slightly away from his body, a deceptively neutral posture. His golden eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the group. He recognized the leader's type instantly. This was Che. The man who had guided the Avatar. The man whose fear was a palpable force. "I am not here for a fight," Zuko stated, his voice calm, cutting through the tense silence. It was the voice of the Crown Prince, accustomed to command. Che let out a short, brittle laugh that held no humor. "They all say that. Right before they try to drag us back in chains. Or put a knife in our backs." His eyes raked over Zuko's armor, his proud stance. "Officer. I can smell it on you. The stink of loyalty. You've come to collect the bounty on our heads yourself, haven't you? Think the Fire Lord will give you a promotion?" "I said I am not here for a fight," Zuko repeated, each word laced with icy precision. "I am here to speak with Zhong Zhong." The name sent a visible ripple through the group. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their grips tightening on their weapons. Che's face hardened, his fear momentarily eclipsed by a flash of protective fury. "You don't get to speak his name," Che spat. "You don't get to come here, wearing that armor, and demand anything. We know your kind. You talk about honor while you burn the world." He took a step closer, his sword unwavering. "We've decided. We're not running anymore. We're going to kill you. We're going to send your corpse back to your Fire Lord in a box. A message. A message that we're not afraid anymore." It was a desperate boast from a terrified man. Zuko could see the tremor in Che's sword arm. He could see the uncertainty in the eyes of the others. They were cornered animals, and that made them unpredictable. And dangerous. Zuko's own patience, thin at the best of times, began to fray. The seductive warmth of anger, his oldest and most reliable companion, stirred in his chest. These men, these traitors, stood between him and answers. They threatened him, the Crown Prince, and his own nation's territory. You would raise your weapon to your crown prince? Zuko's voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous growl. The air around him seemed to grow warmer, the mist beginning to steam faintly near his shoulders. You would dare threaten me? You, who abandoned your posts. You, who turned your backs on your nation, on your Fire Lord, on your very honor? The title Crown Prince landed with the force of a physical blow. Che's eyes widened, his bravado cracking. The other men recoiled slightly, murmurs of disbelief and fresh fear passing between them. They had expected an officer, perhaps a captain. Not the son of Ozai himself. Liar! Che stammered, trying to reclaim his momentum. The prince wouldn't, he wouldn't come here alone. You think I need an army to deal with the likes of you? Zuko snarled, taking a single, deliberate step forward. The deserters flinched as one, their weapons rising higher. You are traitors. You are cowards. You are a disgrace to the uniform you once wore. The only reason you are still breathing is because I require something from your master. Now, stand aside. He unleashed his will then, not with a burst of flame, but with a wave of suffocating pressure. It was the same aura he had used against Azula in the forest, a primal assertion of dominance that seemed to drain the oxygen from the air. The mist recoiled from him in a wide circle. The deserters gasped, their faces paling. They felt it, the terrifying, ancient power that radiated from the young man before them. This was no mere officer. This was something else entirely. Che, driven by sheer, panicked instinct, raised his sword. For our freedom, he screamed, a desperate, paradoxical battle cry, and lunged. It was the spark that lit the fuse. The other men, spurred by his action, surged forward. Zuko's hands ignited, twin suns blazing to life in the gray mist. His body settled into a fluid, deadly stance. He would burn through them all if he had to. He would. Enough. The word was not loud. It was not a shout. Yet it cut through the tension like a knife, silencing the impending clash instantly. It was a voice withered by age and regret, yet imbued with an authority that had nothing to do with rank or title. From the deepest part of the mist, a figure emerged. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in simple, dark robes. His hair was long and white, tied back from a severe, lined face. His eyes, deep-set and weary, held a profound sadness, but also a core of unshakable resolve. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his age, each step deliberate and silent. It was Zhang Zhang, the deserter, the master firebender. He walked into the center of the standoff, placing himself between Che's trembling sword and Zuko's blazing fists. He did not look at the deserters. His piercing gaze was fixed solely on Zuko, studying him, seeing past the armor, past the title, past the rage. "Lower your sword, Che," Zhang Zhang said, his voice calm but firm. "And you, Prince Zuko. Extinguish your flames. There will be no violence here today." The command was absolute. Che's arm dropped as if the strength had left it, his sword point sinking into the dirt. The other men shuffled back, their weapons lowering, their postures slackening with a mixture of relief and awe. Zuko, after a long, tense moment, allowed the fire around his hands to die. The light vanished, leaving the misty gloom feeling darker than before. The oppressive heat radiating from him receded, though the intensity in his golden eyes did not. Zhang Zhang's gaze swept over Zuko, taking in the proud set of his shoulders, the infamous scar that marred his face, the conflict that raged behind his eyes. "The crown prince of the Fire Nation," he murmured, his tone unreadable. "So the rumors of your transformation are true. The dragon of Nanhai, walking alone into the forest to seek out a traitor." "Why?" Zuko met his gaze unflinchingly. The time for cryptic games was over. "I am not my father," he stated, the words feeling like a vow and a confession all at once. "And I need to learn how not to be." Chapter 74, The Master's Guidance. The tension in the clearing did not dissipate, it transformed. The aggressive energy of the impending fight was replaced by a thick, watchful silence. Zhang Zhang's deserters did not lower their weapons entirely, their grips still white-knuckled, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear, confusion, and a dawning, horrifying realization of who they had just threatened. Che looked as if he might be sick, his gaze darting between his master and the brooding crown prince. Zhang Zhang, however, seemed to exist in a pocket of perfect calm. He regarded Zuko for a long moment, his ancient, weary eyes performing a silent dissection. He saw the armor of a conqueror, the scar of a victim, and the eyes of a young man drowning in a conflict he could not name. "You will come with me," Zhang Zhang said finally. It was not a request, nor was it a command issued from a subordinate to a prince. It was a statement of fact, an invitation from one master of fire to another, albeit a far younger and more volatile one. "We will speak. The others will keep their watch." He turned without another word and began to walk back into the mist-shrouded bamboo forest. Zuko hesitated for only a second, his pride warring with his desperate need for answers. The need won. He fell into step behind the old master, ignoring the stunned, hostile looks from the deserters. They walked in silence along a path so hidden it was invisible to Zuko. Zhang Zhang moved with an effortless, soundless grace, his dark robes whispering against the damp undergrowth. After a few minutes, they arrived at a small, secluded clearing where a simple tent of patched canvas was pitched beside a trickling stream. It was a Spartan existence, a world away from the opulence of the governor's manor or even the austere comfort of a military barracks. Zhang Zhang held open the tent flap. "Enter." Zuko had to duck his head to step inside. The interior was as austere as the outside. A thin bedroll, a single oil lamp, a small chest, and a low wooden table upon which sat a simple, unglazed teapot and 2 cups. There were no comforts, no personal effects. It was the dwelling of a man who had shed everything, including his own past. "Sit," Zhang Zhang instructed, gesturing to a cushion on the floor opposite the table. Zuko, unaccustomed to taking orders, found himself complying, his armor creaking as he settled into the seated position. The old master knelt with a fluid ease that spoke of a lifetime of discipline. He picked up the teapot. It was cold, the leaves within dry. He did not reach for a tinderbox. He simply held the pot in his cupped hands. A moment later, a gentle, consistent heat began to radiate from his palms. There was no visible flame, no roaring fire. It was a profound, precise application of energy, a gentle coaxing of heat that began to warm the ceramic. Soon, a soft plume of steam issued from the spout, carrying the delicate scent of jasmine. He had boiled water using only the heat of his own hands. As he poured the hot water over the leaves, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "You are alive at this moment for 2 reasons, Prince Zuko. The first is that Che and the others are frightened men, not foolish ones. They ambushed you with steel, not fire, for fire is a beacon. It would have drawn every Fire Nation patrol within a league to this place. They sought a quick, silent kill." Zuko's jaw tightened. It would not have been quick. And I would not have been the one killed. He met Zhang Zhang's gaze across the steaming tea. It would have been difficult. There were many of them. But I would have one. Zhang Zhang paused in his pouring, the stream of tea halting for a fraction of a second. He looked at Zuko, not with challenge, but with a deep, analytical curiosity. It was not the boast of an arrogant boy. It was the cold, factual assessment of a warrior who had stared down impossible odds and knew his own capabilities. The old master gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if filing this information away. He finished pouring and set a cup before Zuko. "The second reason you are alive," Zhang Zhang continued, "is because of the man whose blood runs in your veins. Not the Fire Lord. The other one. Your uncle." Zuko stiffened. "Iroh?" "General Iroh," Zhang Zhang corrected softly, a hint of something resembling respect in his tone. "A man who understood the weight of fire long before he laid down his arms. He and I, our paths crossed in the past. He showed me a kindness, a discretion, when by all rights he should not have. I owe him a debt. And thus, his nephew is granted an audience, instead of being left as a warning to his father. The tea was hot and fragrant. Zuko did not drink. His mind was reeling. Iroha's influence, his legacy of unexpected mercy, had once again reached out to protect him across countless miles. You said you were not your father, Zhang Zhang stated, steering the conversation back to its heart with the precision of a surgeon's blade. And that you need to learn how not to be. Explain this. Zuko looked into the depths of his tea, as if the answers might be swirling there among the leaves. Where could he even begin? The words felt clumsy, dangerous. My father, the Fire Lord, believes fire is only a weapon. A tool for domination. It is only destruction. It is only power. He struggled to articulate the duality that lived within him, the Victor-ness that recoiled at the horror, and the Zuko-ness that craved the strength. I have seen that. I have been that. But I have also felt it as something else. A source of life. Of energy. Not just for destroying, but for creating. For warming. He trailed off, frustrated, his fists clenching on his knees. Zhang Zhang listened, his expression unreadable. You speak of the duality of fire. This is not a new concept, Prince Zuko. It is the oldest truth of our element. It is the first lesson that has been forgotten, buried under a century of war and propaganda. That it is a destructive force is its nature. That it can be a creative one is its discipline. The Fire Nation now only teaches the nature and calls it strength. It ignores the discipline and calls it weakness. Why? Zuko asked, the word bursting from him. Why did you leave? You were an admiral. You had power, respect. Why abandon it all? Why choose this? He gestured around the sparse tent. Zhang Zhang's severe face seemed to grow even more somber. I did not abandon my post. I abandoned the perversion of my element. I saw where the path led. I saw the endless cycle of burning. We burn the earth, we burn the villages, we burn the people. And in doing so, we burn our own souls until nothing is left but ash and hunger. He looked directly at Zuko, his gaze piercing. Fire is a hungry element, Prince Zuko. It consumes. It must be fed. The Fire Nation feeds it with conquest, with hatred. It is a gluttonous, out-of-control blaze that will eventually consume itself. I could not be a part of that feeding any longer. He took a slow sip of his tea. I left because I chose control. I chose to feed my fire with discipline, with respect. To use it to boil water for tea. To warm a cold night. To defend, not to attack. This, he said, indicating their surroundings, is not poverty. It is freedom. It is the freedom of not being a slave to the hunger. Zuko felt the words resonate deep within him. The hunger. He knew it well. The hunger for approval, for victory, for his father's love. It was an insatiable fire that had consumed his childhood, his honor, his very face. They call you a traitor, Zuko said, his voice low. They call a man who refuses to murder a traitor, Zhang Zhang replied, his tone flat, devoid of bitterness. They call a man who questions the endless burning a coward. I wear those labels now. They are lighter than the armor of an admiral who must order young men to die for a cause that expands only for the sake of expansion. And the war? Zuko pressed, leaning forward. What of the war? The Fire Nation brings prosperity. Order. We are spreading our greatness. We are spreading ash, Zhang Zhang interrupted, his voice hardening for the first time. Do not repeat the lies they feed you in the palace. Look with your own eyes. You have been to the Earth Kingdom. You have seen the scorched fields, the broken cities, the fear in the eyes of the people. Is that prosperity? Is that order? It is the order of the grave. It is a greatness built on a mountain of skulls. A fire that burns too hot and too wide leaves only barren waste behind. It cannot build. It can only destroy. The truth of it, stated so bluntly by this legendary figure, hit Zuko with the force of a physical blow. He had seen it. He had been the one holding the torch. He thought of the villages he'd raided in his hunt for the Avatar, the terror he'd inflicted, all in the name of an honor that now seemed like a sick joke. How? Zuko whispered, the word choked. How do you control it? The hunger? The rage? It's always there. A constant heat under the skin. How do you make it obey? Zhong studied the young prince before him, seeing not a symbol of oppression, but a deeply tormented boy wrestling with a dragon inside his own heart. You do not command it like a servant, the old master said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. You must understand it. You must respect it. You must never, ever fear it, for fear leads to loss of control. But you must also never revel in it, for that leads to the same end. You must find the balance. The razor's edge between control and surrender. It is the hardest lesson. It is a lesson your father never learned. And it is a lesson that will define your entire life, Prince Zuko. He leaned forward, his intense eyes holding Zuko's. You have immense power. I can feel it radiating from you. It is raw, untamed, like a wildfire. You can let it consume you, and become a monster greater than any who have come before you. Or you can learn to harness it. To channel it. To use it for something more than destruction. The choice is yours. But choose quickly. For a fire that burns as brightly as yours cannot be left to smolder for long. Silence fell in the tent, broken only by the gentle hiss of the oil lamp. Zuko looked at the legendary deserter, this man who had given up everything for his principles, and for the first time, he felt not judgment, but a staggering, profound admiration. Here was true strength. Not the strength of armies, but the strength of conviction. The strength to walk away from everything to remain true to oneself. I want to learn, Zuko said, the admission leading his lips quietly, yet with the weight of an oath. Not just how to control it. I want to understand it. As you do. Zhong held his gaze for a long, timeless moment. Then, he gave a slow, grave nod. But understand, Prince of the Fire Nation, the first thing you must learn is that to master fire, you must first master yourself. And that is a battle that never ends. Chapter 75, The Path of No Return. The tea in Zuko's cup had gone cold. The delicate aroma of jasmine had faded, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of the tent and the lingering weight of the words that had passed between them. The silence was no longer tense, but pensive, filled with the immensity of the admission Zuko had just made and the daunting path that now lay before him. He watched Zhong, who sat with the stillness of a mountain, his eyes closed as if in meditation or deep remembrance. The old master had laid bare the rotten core of the Fire Nation's ideology with the clinical precision of a surgeon excising a tumor. He had offered no hope, only a stark, unvarnished truth. And yet, for Zuko, that truth was a kind of hope in itself. It was a diagnosis for a sickness he had felt but could not name. The part of him that was Victor, the man from a world of relative peace, recoiled at the horror story Zhong had woven. The part of him that was Zuko, the crown prince raised on propaganda and a desperate need for approval, felt the foundations of his world cracking. But beneath the cracking, something new and solid was being revealed. There must be a way back, Zuko said, his voice cutting through the quiet. It was not a plea, but a statement of conviction. Zhong's eyes opened slowly. They were deep pools of resigned wisdom. For whom? For you, Zuko insisted, leaning forward. The cold tea forgotten. For men like you. For those who saw the truth and could not stomach the lie. The Fire Nation shouldn't, it can't just lose its best minds, its most honorable soldiers, to exile. It weakens us. It robs us of our conscience. A faint, sad smile touched Zhong's lips. It was a rare expression on his severe face. You speak like a reformer, Prince Zuko. Not a conqueror. That is a dangerous thing to be in the court of your father. I am not my father, Zuko repeated, the words firmer now, more sure. When I am Fire Lord, things will be different. There will be changes. There will have to be. A nation built only on conquest has no future. It only has an ending. He was speaking Victor's thoughts now, but they felt right. They felt like his own. There could be amnesty. For those who left for reasons of conscience. A chance to come home. To help rebuild something better. He saw it then, a flicker in Zhang Zhang's eyes. Not of hope, but of a profound, aching sorrow. It was the look of a man who had long ago buried any thought of home. Prince Zuko, Zhang Zhang said, his voice low and grave. Look at me. Truly look at me. I am not a soldier on extended leave. I am not a dissident awaiting a change in policy. I am a traitor. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of your father, in the eyes of the nation I once served, I am the enemy. My name is a curse, my face is on wanted posters in every colony. There is no way back for me. The path I chose only leads forward, deeper into the wilderness, or it ends at the executioner's block. There is no third option. There is always a chance. Zuko's voice rose, edged with a frustration born of his newfound, fragile idealism. If I am on the throne, I can make that chance. I can pardon you. I can restore your honor. And what of my men? Zhang Zhang asked, his gaze unwavering. Che? The others? Will you pardon them all? And what of the thousands of others who have deserted over the last 100 years? Will you track them all down and offer them a place back in the machine they fled? And what of the families of the soldiers they may have killed in their escape? Will you pardon that too? Zuko opened his mouth to reply, but found no words. The sheer, logistical, political, and moral enormity of it crashed down on him. It was a naive dream, the wish of a prince who had not yet grasped the immense, grinding inertia of a nation and a war a century in the making. Do not place your faith in me, Prince Zuko, Zhang Zhang said, his tone not unkind, but firm, like a master correcting a talented but misguided student. Do not build your future on the hope of my redemption, or that of men like me. Your path and mine may have crossed today, but they are not the same. My fight is over. I have made my choice. My only duty now is to live with it, and to protect the few souls who have chosen to follow me into exile. He leaned forward, the oil lamp casting deep shadows across the lines of his face. Your fight is just beginning. It is a far more difficult one. Your enemy is not the Earth Kingdom. Your enemy is not the Avatar. Your enemy is the legacy of your ancestors. It is the culture of your nation. It is the fire that burns in your own heart. That is the battle you must win. Not for me, but for yourself. And if you can win that battle, truly win it, then perhaps you will not need to offer amnesty to deserters. Perhaps you will have built a fire nation that men have no reason to desert from. The words settled over Zuko, dousing the last embers of his hopeful fantasy. Zhang Zhang was not rejecting the idea out of hand, he was revealing its childish simplicity. He was offering a starker, harder, but ultimately more real hope. The hope of building something new, rather than patching something irreparably broken. Zuko slowly nodded, the gesture one of acceptance, not defeat. He understood. The way back was not through pardons and proclamations. The way forward was through transformation. A transformation that had to start with him. He rose from the cushion, his armor feeling heavier than it had when he entered. Thank you for the tea, he said, his voice formal once more, but with a new respect woven through it. And for your counsel. Zhang Zhang remained seated, offering a slight, respectful bow of his head. The path out is the same as the path in. The mist will still be thick. Move with care. Zuko ducked out of the tent, leaving the old master in his sparse sanctuary of principle. The cold morning air hit his face, sharp and bracing. The world outside was unchanged, the same mist, the the same silent bamboo forest, the same hidden danger. But he felt fundamentally altered. His walk back through the forest was a solitary pilgrimage. The mist, which had felt ominous and claustrophobic on his way in, now felt like a shroud, protecting him, allowing him to process the seismic shift in his soul. He replayed the conversation in his head, each of Zhang Zhang's statements a stone dropped into the still pond of his consciousness, the ripples spreading out to touch every part of his being. A fire that burns too hot and too wide leaves only barren waste behind. He saw the scorched earth of 100 battlefields, the hollow eyes of refugees, the smoldering ruins of villages that had dared to be in his way. You must find the balance. The razor's edge between control and surrender. He felt the truth of it in his own bending, in the wild, terrifying power he had unleashed on Jet, and the precise, controlled heat he had used to boil a pot of tea. Your enemy is the fire that burns in your own heart. This was the hardest truth. His father, the war, the quest for the Avatar, they were all external manifestations of the conflict within himself. The hunger for love, for honor, for purpose. A hunger he had always tried to sate with destruction. He moved through the drying riverbed, his senses still alert, but his mind was a world away. He was no longer just a hunter. He was a student. He was a prince who had just been shown the devastating cost of his birthright and the monumental task required to redeem it. The sounds of the waking town began to filter through the trees, a distant murmur of life continuing its oblivious course. He could see the rooftops of the colony through the thinning mist. Soon, he would be back within its walls. Back to Rin and Li and their fearful, knowing silence. Back to Azula and her razor-sharp suspicions. Back to the role of the Dragon of Nanhai, the conquering hero. But the role no longer fit. The armor felt like a costume. The adulation of the crowd would feel like a lie. He had walked into the forest as a prince seeking a traitor. He was walking out as a man who had found a mirror, and in it, he had seen the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of a different path. He reached the edge of the forest and paused, looking back at the wall of mist and bamboo. Somewhere in there, a man who had once been an admiral waited, a man who had chosen freedom over power, principle over patriotism. There was no way back for him. Zhang Zhang was right. But for Zuko, standing on the precipice of his future, there was still a way forward. It was narrow, fraught with danger, and paved with impossible choices. But for the first time, he could see it. And he knew, with a certainty that burned brighter than any rage, that he would have to walk it alone. Zuko pushed the heavy oak door of his assigned chamber shut, the solid thud a welcome barrier against the world. He leaned back against it for a moment, allowing the weight of the morning, the mist, the confrontation, the devastating conversation, to settle fully upon his shoulders. He let out a long, slow breath, the kind that sought to expel not just air, but the very fatigue in his soul. He needed a moment of silence. A moment to strip off the armor of the Dragon of Nanhai and just be the confused, fractured young man beneath. Out for a morning stroll, brother? The forest seems an odd choice for a constitutional. No cheering crowds, no fawning magistrates. It's almost as if you were seeking solitude. The voice, smooth as polished serpent stone and just as cold, came from the deep armchair in the corner of the room, turned toward the crackling fireplace. Zuko's head snapped up, his body tensing instantly. Azula sat there, perfectly postured, one leg crossed over the other, examining her nails with an air of detached boredom that was utterly feigned. She had been waiting. He straightened up, his mask of impassive control slamming back into place. "What are you doing in my room, Azula?" She finally looked at him, her golden eyes sweeping over his travel-worn armor, the faint dampness still clinging to his boots, the lingering chill of the mist that seemed to emanate from him. Curiosity. A prince vanishes from his own victory celebration without a word to his subordinates, without his royal retinue, and slips into a forest known to harbor undesirable elements. One might call it concerning. A wiser soul might call it suspicious. "I don't have to explain myself to you," Zuko bit out, striding across the room to the wash basin, turning his back on her. He poured water, the splash unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. Don't you? She asked, her voice deceptively light. We have a deal, Zuko. Or has your newfound celebrity addled your memory? Our little arrangement back on home. I surrender myself to you, I tolerate your sentimental attachment to your common-born soldiers, and in return, you focus every fiber of your being on capturing the Avatar. Wandering off alone into the wilderness for hours doesn't strike me as focused. Zuko scrubbed the cool water over his face, the shock of it a welcome distraction from the heat of his rising anger. Not everything I do is about the Avatar, he growled, his voice muffled by the towel. He heard the soft rustle of silk as she stood. It should be, she said, her voice closer now, losing its playful edge and gaining a sharp, metallic quality. It should be the single, primary thought in your mind. The first thing you consider when you wake and the last before you sleep. Our deal, and the success it promises, should be the engine of your every action. Anything else is a distraction. And distractions are a luxury you cannot afford. He whirled to face her, the towel clenched in his fist. I am more than capable of multitasking, Azula. Or have you forgotten who vaporized the Nanhai fleet? Who crushed General Fong? I don't need you to lecture me on focus. She was standing mere feet away, her head tilted, a predator studying a creature that had just bared its teeth in a novel way. Her gaze was intense, serious, all pretense of boredom gone. What did you find in that forest, Zuko? She asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You seem a little different. You're speaking in circles. In riddles. It doesn't suit you. A bitter, hollow laugh escaped him. To me as well, Azula, he said, the truth slipping out before he could cage it. To me as well. He saw the flicker of genuine, uncalculated surprise in her eyes. It was there for only a second, but he caught it. She had expected defiance, rage, denial. She had not expected this weary, cryptic admission. She took a final, measured step forward, closing the distance between them. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. I will make this very simple, brother. You want to play your secret games? You want to wander in misty forests and come back smelling of philosophy and regret? Fine. But you will do it without me. Her meaning was crystal clear. It was a withdrawal, a sanction. You won't have a chance to touch me, she stated, her voice flat and absolute. You won't so much as lay a finger on my skin until you can lay something concrete about the Avatar at my feet. A location. A prisoner. A confirmed sighting. Something real. Not whispers and riddles. Zuko said nothing. He just held her gaze, his own a storm of conflicting emotions, rage, frustration, and a strange, defiant relief. Her body was a weapon she knew how to wield, and she was sheathing it. In a way, it simplified things. Azula took his silence for what it was, not acceptance, but a stalemate. A faint, cold smile returned to her lips. I'm not so sure you can multitask, Zuzu. I suppose we'll find out. With a final, sweeping glance, she turned and glided from the room, the door clicking shut behind her with an air of finality. Zuko stood alone in the sudden quiet, the echo of her ultimatum hanging in the air. He felt clean. The last tether of that complicated, toxic intimacy had been severed by her own hand. The path ahead was his alone. Azula's footsteps were silent on the plush runner of the manor's upper hall. The pleasant mask she wore for the public had melted away, leaving a countenance of cold, pure calculation. She turned a corner into a secluded, shadowy alcove, away from the windows and the noise of the town below. A figure detached itself from the deeper shadows, a man clad in the nondescript, dark garb of a messenger, his face obscured by a deep hood. He bowed low. Azula did not look at him, her gaze fixed on a tapestry depicting some forgotten Fire Nation victory. Send word to Ty Lee and Mai. They are to depart Nanhai immediately and begin with operations. Their particular skills are now required. The figure bowed again. Immediately, Princess. It's time to begin, she said, the words a quiet, definitive command. The messenger vanished back into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. Azula remained in the alcove for a long moment, the only sound her own steady breathing. A slow, cruel smile spread across her perfect features, a sight more terrifying than any scowl. "You have underestimated me for the final time, Zuko," she whispered to the empty corridor, her voice dripping with a venomous promise. "It's time you—" Chapter 76, The Wrong Path, The Right Question. The column departed the Fire Nation colony under a sky the color of bruised parchment. The festive garlands and paper lanterns of the Sun Festival looked garish and forlorn in the gray morning light, remnants of a celebration whose guest of honor was already moving on. Zuko led from the front, his Komodo rhino's heavy footfalls a steady, grinding rhythm on the hard-packed earth. He had given the order that morning with a cold, clipped efficiency that brooked no discussion. They were heading for the mountains of the western continent, to a place called the Western Air Temple. He offered no further explanation, and the sheer specificity of the destination had silenced any questions before they could be asked. Azula fell in at the rear of the main party, her own mount keeping a disdainful distance from the common soldiers. Her posture was one of utter boredom, but her eyes, sharp and calculating, missed nothing. The unspoken severance of their arrangement lay between them like a chasm, and the journey became a silent contest of wills, a race along the same path for entirely different reasons. For 2 days, they traveled northwest, leaving the fertile river valleys behind and climbing into the rugged, pine-covered foothills. The air grew thin and sharp. The vibrant greens of the lowlands gave way to the dark, somber hues of the high country. The mood within the party was fractured. Rin was quieter than usual, his usual gruff commentary replaced by a watchful, almost sullen silence. Lee, while maintaining his usual analytical demeanor, had developed a habit of checking and rechecking his map scrolls with a nervous intensity. On the afternoon of the third day, they made camp on a high ridge that offered a staggering view of the jagged, snow-capped mountains they were destined for. The Western Air Temple was out there, a ghost in the stone. As the soldiers set up tents and lit cook fires, Zuko stood at the edge of the ridge, his cloak whipping around him in the bitter wind. He watched the distant peaks, his mind a tempest of Zhong's warnings and Azula's cold ultimatum. He needed a distraction. An anchor to the mundane. He turned from the view, his eyes scanning the camp until they landed on Lee, who was seated on a fallen log, meticulously annotating a map with a charcoal stick. "Lee," Zuko called out, his voice cutting through the wind. "A word. In private." Lee looked up, a flicker of that now familiar wariness in his eyes. He carefully rolled his map and stood, following Zuko as the prince strode away from the main camp, down a narrow game trail that led to a small, sheltered clearing overlooking a deep ravine. The sound of the wind faded to a dull roar above them. Zuko stopped, turning to face his strategist. He did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch, watching Lee stand there, perfectly still, waiting for his prince to speak. "How is Hinero?" Zuko asked, the question sudden and utterly unexpected. Lee blinked, thrown completely off balance. My wife, Your Highness?" "Unless you have married another Kyoshi warrior without informing me, yes, your wife," Zuko said, a faint, almost imperceptible trace of dry amusement in his tone. "The last I heard, there was some difficulty regarding the consummation of your union." Lee's ears turned a bright, unmistakable shade of red. He cleared his throat, adjusting his grip on his map scroll. "Ah. Yes. That particular, logistical and emotional impasse has been successfully navigated." Zuko raised a single eyebrow. "Navigated?" "Resolved," Lee corrected quickly, his vocabulary failing him for once. "It is resolved. Quite thoroughly." "Thoroughly?" Zuko pressed, the corner of his mouth threatening to twitch upwards. He had not felt this kind of mundane amusement in what felt like a lifetime. "Define thoroughly." Lee looked genuinely pained, his analytical mind clearly struggling to find the correct terminology for such an unscientific subject. "Prince Zuko, with all due respect, the specific mechanics and frequency are perhaps beyond the scope of a military debriefing." Frequency? Zuko repeated, and this time he did smile, a brief, sharp flash of teeth. So it was not a singular event. You have been busy. Lee stared at a point somewhere over Zuko's shoulder, his face a mask of academic mortification. Well, it all began that night after the battle against General Fong. The period following our departure from Nanhai was characterized by a series of mutually agreed-upon interactions that successfully facilitated the finalization of our marital bonds. The initial encounter, while somewhat pedagogically challenging, ultimately proved to be a catalyst for a more streamlined and efficient process in subsequent iterations. Zuko let out a short, sharp laugh, the sound foreign to his own ears. By Agni, Lee. You make it sound like you were optimizing a supply chain. Did you file a report afterwards? Chart the data? Lee finally looked at him, a flicker of genuine confusion in his eyes. A report would be highly irregular, sir. And ethically questionable. Though I did make some private notes on potential areas for improved synchronization. This sent Zuko into another, quieter fit of laughter. He shook his head, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. For a moment, it was just two young men talking about something normal, something human. But the moment could not last. The shadow that hung over them was too long. The laughter died in Zuko's throat. His expression grew serious, his golden eyes fixing on Lee with an unnerving intensity. The shift was so abrupt it was like a door slamming shut. Which is more than I can say for you and Rin, Zuko said, his voice losing all its prior warmth, becoming flat and hard. You have not been streamlined or efficient. You have been clumsy. You look at me as if I am a spirit that might possess you in the night. You flinch when I give an order. You hold your breath when I walk past. Lee's embarrassed flush vanished, replaced by a pallor of dread. The comfortable ground of marital awkwardness had fallen away, and they were back on the razor's edge. Prince Zuko! Do not insult me by pretending you don't know what I am talking about, Zuko interrupted, his voice a low growl. I brought you in here, into the confidence of your crown prince, and I asked you a question. You will answer it. You and Rin have been acting like spooked ostrich horses since the morning after the forest ambush. Since I reminded you of what you overheard on watch. We are going to talk about it. Now. Lee swallowed hard. He looked down at the ground, then at the ravine, anywhere but at Zuko's face. The scholarly composure was gone, replaced by the raw fear of a man who knows he is standing on a precipice. It is difficult, Your Highness, Lee began, his voice hushed. To unsee what has been seen. To unhear what has been heard. We are your men. Our loyalty is to you. It is absolute. But that night, it recontextualized everything. Recontextualized, Zuko echoed, the word a weapon. What does that mean? Speak plainly, for once. It means we saw a side of you we were not meant to see. Lee's voice rose, fueled by a surge of desperate courage. We saw the prince, our commander, and then we heard something else. Something private. Something intense. And then you confronted us. You confirmed it. You made us accomplices to a secret that could see us executed 100 times over. It is not just that we know. It is that you know we know. Every look we share with you is now layered with that knowledge. Every order you give is filtered through it. We are terrified of what it means. We are terrified of what it might make you do. We are terrified that Princess Azula might somehow discern our knowledge and have us silenced. We are living in a state of perpetual, high-alert anxiety, and it is exhausting. The confession hung in the thin mountain air, laid bare between them. There was no scholarly vocabulary left, only blunt, terrified truth. Zuko stared at him, his own anger cooling into something more complex. He saw the genuine fear in Lee's eyes, the weight of the secret he had forced them to carry. He had been so focused on his own shame, his own fury at being discovered, that he had not fully considered the prison he had built for them. You think I would harm you? Zuko asked, his voice quieter now. Lee met his gaze, his own filled with a pained honesty. We do not know what you are capable of, Prince Zuko. Not anymore. We saw you breathe fire like a dragon. We saw you defeat Jet with a cruelty we had not seen in you before. And we know you share a bed, and whatever else, with a woman who is both your sister and the most dangerous person we have ever met. You have become an equation with too many variables. The outcome is unpredictable. There it was. The core of it. They were not just afraid of the secret. They were afraid of him. The victor part of him recoiled at the idea. The Zuko part understood it perfectly. Zuko looked away, out over the ravine. The wind howled a lonely tune above them. Your loyalty is to remain absolute, he said, his tone final, leaving no room for argument. Remember what I said to you before. You will bury this. You and Rin. You will lock it away in whatever analytical vault you use for your private notes on marital synchronization. You will never speak of it again. Not to each other. Not to anyone. And you will stop looking at me as if I am about to burn you alive for the crime of having ears. He turned his head, his golden eyes pinning Lee in place. I am your prince. I am your commander. That is the only context you need. Is that understood? Lee stood straighter. The fear was still there, but it was now compartmentalized, forced back into the box of duty. Yes, Your Highness. Perfectly understood. Good, Zuko said. Now, get back to camp. And for Agni's sake, the next time you write to your wife, try using words a normal person would understand. Lee bowed, a deep, formal gesture. I will endeavor to utilize a more colloquial vernacular in my spousal communications. He turned and hurried back up the path, leaving Zuko alone in the clearing. The moment of normalcy was gone, shattered by the reality of his life. He had an army that saw him as a hero, a sister who saw him as a rival, and the two men closest to him saw him as a terrifying, unpredictable equation. And he was leading them all on a long, hard march in the wrong direction. He looked toward the distant western air temple, a cold certainty settling in his gut. He was not just climbing a mountain. He was climbing toward his own ruin. Chapter 77, A Sanctuary in Smoke. For Aang, the world had finally begun to right itself. The lingering horror of the burned forest, the searing memory of Katara's pained cry and the sight of her blistered hands, the crushing weight of his own failure and fear, it all began to lift the higher Appa climbed. The air grew thin and cold, tasting of ice and ancient stone, a flavor he had not realized his soul had been craving for a century. This was his element. This was home. He stood tall on Appa's head, his staff in hand, the wind whipping at his saffron robes. Below, Katara and Sokka huddled amidst the saddle's furs, the latter shivering dramatically. Are you sure this is the right way, Aang? Sokka called out, his teeth chattering. I think my eyebrows are frozen. Can eyebrows freeze? Because mine feel frozen. This is the kind of vital survival information they never teach you in the South Pole. We're close, Sokka. I can feel it. Aang shouted back, his voice buoyant with a hope that had been absent for days. The Northern Air Temple. It's one of the 4 great sanctuaries. It's going to be perfect. Just like it was. Untouched. Serene. You'll see. Katara smiled up at him, her hands, now healed thanks to her own healing abilities, tucked warmly into her sleeves. I can't wait to see it, Aang. A real piece of your home. Yeah, great, Sokka muttered, pulling his parka tighter. Serene. I'm hoping for a nice, serene, indoor fireplace. With a spitted roast boar. A serene, roasting boar. That's my kind of spirituality. Aang just laughed, a free, joyful sound that was carried away by the mountain winds. He urged Appa higher, navigating through a labyrinth of jagged, snow-dusted peaks that pierced the sky like stone spears. He moved on instinct, a homing pigeon drawn to a roost it had never seen but knew in its bones. There! Aang cried out, pointing excitedly. Just beyond that ridge. That's where it is. Appa bellowed a low, echoing groan and surged forward, clearing the final, towering ridge. The valley beyond opened up before them, a breathtaking panorama of interconnected peaks and deep ravines, all carved from pale, elegant stone. And there, nestled into the very face of the mountain, was the Northern Air Temple. Its architecture was a marvel of grace and impossibility, with sweeping, curved spires and wide, open pavilions that seemed to float, defying the very pull of the earth. Aang's heart swelled until he felt it might burst. But then, his smile faltered. His eyes, sharpened by 100 years of absence, saw what should not be. What is that?" he whispered, the joy in his voice draining away. A thin, gray tendril of smoke was rising from the heart of the temple. Then another. And another. Soon, they could see multiple plumes, a dozen or more, coiling up from the sacred courtyards and pavilions to stain the pristine alpine air. "Smoke?" Katara said, her voice laced with confusion. "Why would there be fire? I thought the air nomads." "We didn't need fire," Aang finished, his voice tight. "Not like that. We had steam vents, geothermal springs, not smoke." The word was dirty in his mouth. Fire was for light, for ceremony on rare occasions, not for this industry that scarred the sky. Sokka, his chill forgotten, leaned forward, his warrior's instincts kicking in. "Okay, that's not good. That is definitely not the untouched serenity you were promising. That looks inhabited." Aang didn't answer. He urged Appa into a slow, cautious descent, his eyes fixed on the temple below. The closer they got, the more his confusion and dismay curdled into a profound, gut-wrenching sense of violation. The beautiful, flowing lines of the temple were broken. Everywhere he looked, the elegant stonework was marred by crude, boxy additions cobbled together from wood and rough-hewn rock. Strange, metallic structures jutted out at awkward angles. He could see lines, ropes, and crude pulleys strung between the ancient pillars. The wide, open-air courtyards, designed for meditation and airball, were now cluttered with piles of timber and strange, tarp-covered shapes. "It's different," Katara said softly, trying to find a diplomatic word for the desecration unfolding before them. "Different?" Aang's voice was hollow. They've built shacks on the meditation plaza. Look! They've blocked the wind tunnels." Appa landed with a soft thud in a large courtyard that had once been a place for young airbenders to practice their gliding. The stone was cracked and stained. The air, which should have carried only the sound of the wind and the distant calls of sky bison, was now filled with a discordant symphony of alien noises. The clang of a hammer on metal. The distant shout of a voice that was not a monk's chant. The squeal of an unoiled pulley. They dismounted, Aang moving as if in a trance. He walked slowly towards the center of the courtyard, his staff held tight, his knuckles white. He reached out and touched one of the ancient pillars. The stone was cold, but it felt wrong. It felt wounded. "Hello?" Katara called out, her voice echoing strangely in the polluted silence. "Is anyone here?" For a moment, there was no response. Then, a head popped up from behind a low wall. It was a man, his face smudged with soot, wearing thick, earth-toned workman's clothes. He stared at them, his eyes wide with surprise, then with a dawning curiosity. Then another person appeared, a woman carrying a basket of laundry. Then a child, peeking out from behind her mother's skirts. They were not air nomads. Their clothing was heavy, practical, woven from wool and cotton, not the light, flowing silks of the airbenders. Their faces were ruddy from wind and sun, their postures grounded, earthbound. They were Earth Kingdom people. "Who are you?" the soot-smudged man asked, his tone not hostile, but deeply cautious. "What are you doing here?" Aang stepped forward, his heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. "I am Aang," he said, and the name felt insignificant. I am an air nomad. This is my home." A ripple of murmuring went through the small, gathering crowd. They looked at his arrows, his staff, his robes, with a kind of bewildered awe, as if he were a character from a legend stepped directly into their reality. "An air nomad," the man repeated, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "But, they're all—" "I've been away," Aang interrupted, his voice strained. What are you all doing here? What have you done to the temple?" The man's expression shifted from confusion to a defensive pride. "What have we done? We've made it a home. Our village was destroyed by a flood. We had nowhere to go. We found this place, empty and falling apart, and we fixed it. We made it livable." "Livable?" Aang's voice cracked. He gestured wildly at a nearby wall where a beautiful, faded mural of flying bison had been partially chiseled away to make room for a wooden support beam. "You call this livable? You've ruined it! You've filled the silence with noise. You've blocked the winds with your things." The crowd grew, their faces now hardening. This strange, angry boy was not a mythical savior, he was a threat. "We saved it from crumbling into the ravine," a woman shouted from the back. "It was a ghost town," another man added. "We needed a home," a child's voice piped up. Aang felt their collective gaze like a physical pressure. He was an outsider in his own home. The sanctuary he had dreamed of, the last untouched piece of his world, was gone. Not destroyed by fire, but dismantled, repurposed, and occupied. It was a different kind of death, one that was somehow more painful. He stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of his people and the living, breathing proof of their extinction, and felt more alone than he ever had in the iceberg. The soaring hope of his approach had crashed into the hard, ugly reality of the discovery, and the shock of it left him utterly, devastatingly silent. Chapter 78: The Mechanist's Welcome. The tension in the courtyard was a physical presence, thick and heavy as the mountain air. Aang stood frozen, his chest tight, his gaze darting from one altered stone to another, each modification feeling like a fresh wound. The Earth Kingdom refugees formed a loose, wary circle around the newcomers, their initial curiosity hardening into defensiveness. This was their sanctuary too, now, and this arrow-headed boy was challenging that. "Ruined," the soot-smudged man repeated, his voice rising with indignation. "You march into our home, a place we built with our own hands from ruins, and you dare call it ruined? Your home?" Aang's voice was small, choked with emotion. This was a temple. A place of peace and learning. It wasn't meant to be a factory. He pointed a trembling finger at a blackened metal chimney pipe that had been crudely fitted into a once elegant archway, belching a thin stream of gray smoke. Before the man could retort, a new voice, calm and inquisitive, cut through the brewing argument. Now, what seems to be the trouble here?" The crowd parted respectfully as a man emerged from a nearby doorway that had been enlarged and fitted with a heavy wooden frame. He was older, with a kind, intelligent face framed by spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a long, practical robe of Earth Kingdom green, but it was covered by a leather apron stained with oil and soot. In his hands, he held a complex-looking device of gears and wires, which he tinkered with absently as he approached. This was the Mechanist. "These people just landed on a flying bison, sir," the soot-smudged man explained, gesturing towards Appa. "The boy claims he's an air nomad. Says we've ruined his temple." The Mechanist's busy fingers stilled. He looked up, his eyes magnified behind his glasses, and truly saw Aang for the first time. He took in the traditional robes, the master's tattoos, the ancient glider staff. A look of profound astonishment, followed by a flicker of something that looked like guilt, passed over his features. "An air nomad," the Mechanist breathed, setting his device down carefully on a nearby crate. "By all the spirits. We had believed, that is to say, the historical record suggested, that your people were gone." "We're not gone," Aang said, though the word echoed hollowly in the desecrated courtyard. "I'm still here." "Indeed you are," the Mechanist said, his tone now one of fascinated awe. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning Aang with a scholar's intensity. "A living, breathing relic. A marvel. My boy, you must forgive our shock. And our alterations. When we discovered this place, it was a shell. A beautiful, empty shell, yes, but crumbling into the mountainside. The roof of the great hall had collapsed. The wind was eroding the foundations. We saw not a tomb, but a fortress. A refuge. We have done our best to preserve its structural integrity while making it habitable. Habitable? Aang's voice cracked. You call this habitable? You've covered the singing wind chimes with metal sheets. You've built a shed on the Stargazer's platform. His frustration was boiling over, hot and bitter. Don't you understand? This wasn't just a building. It was a living thing. And you've caged it. Sokka, sensing the conversation was spiraling, stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Aang's shoulder. Hey, let's all just take a deep breath here. I'm Sokka, this is Katara, and the upset one is Aang. We're not here to cause trouble. We were just hoping to find a place to rest. The mechanist's gaze shifted to Sokka, and he nodded, his professional demeanor returning. Of course, of course. Welcome. I am known as the Mechanist. I suppose I am the de facto leader of this little community. He smiled, a warm, genuine expression that eased the tension slightly. We may be refugees, but we still honor the laws of hospitality. Please, you must be tired and hungry after your journey. Allow us to offer you a proper welcome. He gestured for them to follow him, leading them away from the main courtyard and into the heart of the modified temple. The tour that followed was a fresh agony for Aang. Everywhere he looked, his past was being smothered under the weight of the present. The Mechanist chatted amiably, completely oblivious to Aang's inner turmoil. You see, the natural air currents and vertical structure presented fascinating engineering challenges, he explained as they walked through a long gallery that had been converted into a bustling workshop. Looms and spinning wheels, powered by a complex system of belts and pulleys driven by a turning water wheel, clacked and whirred where air acolytes once practiced silent meditation. We've managed to harness the thermal vents for central heating, the Mechanist continued, pointing to a network of copper pipes that ran along the walls, hissing softly. And the old meditation cells made excellent, well-insulated storage rooms. Aang stopped walking, his eyes fixed on a wall where a beautiful, faded mural depicting the life cycle of a sky bison had been partially whitewashed. A detailed schematic of a new pulley system was chalked over it. The Mechanist followed his gaze. Ah, yes. A magnificent piece of art, but the wall space was needed for the new lift calculations. A necessary sacrifice, I'm afraid. Progress often requires difficult choices. Progress? Aang whispered, his heart aching. They entered what had once been the temple's grand refectory. The high, vaulted ceiling was now crisscrossed with wooden scaffolding. The air, which should have smelled of incense and clean stone, was thick with the scent of sawdust, hot metal, and stew. Dozens of people, Earth Kingdom families, looked up from their meals at the long, rough-hewn tables. Children ran between the tables, their laughter echoing loudly in the vast space. As you can see, we've made the best of what we found, the Mechanist said, spreading his arms wide. This is now our communal dining hall. It's the heart of our little society. Aang couldn't speak. He saw a woman using a beautifully carved stone frieze of air spirals as a shelf for her cooking pots. He saw a man using the base of an ancient statue as an anvil. It was a bustling, vibrant, living community, and to Aang, it felt like a waking nightmare. Every laugh, every clang of a pot, every shriek of a playing child was a nail in the coffin of the silent, spiritual world he remembered. Katara, sensing his distress, leaned close. Aang, I know this is hard. But these people, they have nowhere else to go. They're survivors, just like us. They're destroying my culture, Aang murmured, his eyes glistening. They're wiping it away and they don't even know they're doing it. The Mechanist, having shown them the dining hall, led them out onto a wide terrace overlooking the staggering mountain range. The view was still breathtaking, one thing that could not be altered. It is a marvel, is it not? The Mechanist said, breathing in the crisp air. To think, This was all built by your people. Such vision. Such grace. We are merely caretakers. In our own way. He turned to Aang, his expression now genuinely sympathetic. I understand this must be a shock, my boy. To see your home so changed. But I want you to know, we hold the air nomads in the highest respect. Your people's legacy of freedom, of detachment from the earthly world, it is an inspiration. We have simply adapted their vision to our earthly needs. Aang didn't answer. He just stared out at the mountains, the wind cooling the tears he refused to shed. The sanctuary was gone. The hope of finding a piece of his old life was extinguished. All that was left was this painful, complicated reality, and the kind, brilliant man who had presided over its transformation, completely unaware that his progress felt like the final, gentle death of a world. Chapter 79, The Boy Who Touched the Sky. The weight on Aang's chest was a physical thing, a heavy, cold stone of disappointment that made every breath an effort. The mechanist's well-meaning tour had been a special kind of torture, a slow, methodical unveiling of a crime scene where the victim was his own childhood. Every hammer clang was a nail in the coffin of his memories. Every strung-up laundry line was a defilement of a sacred space. He felt like a ghost haunting his own home, invisible and screaming while the new occupants just lived. He drifted away from the others, from Katara's sympathetic looks and Sokka's pragmatic curiosity. He found himself on a high, isolated balcony, one of the few places that seemed relatively untouched. He gripped the smooth, sun-warmed stone of the railing, his knuckles white, and stared out at the endless, beautiful, indifferent sea of mountains. The view was the same. It was the only thing that was. He was so lost in the ache of it all that he didn't hear the soft, rhythmic whirring sound approaching from behind. Hey! The voice was young, friendly, and without a trace of the defensiveness he'd heard from the adults. Aang turned, his expression still clouded with a sorrow too deep for a boy his age. It was the boy from earlier, the one the mechanist had called Teo. He sat in a remarkable chair, a contraption of polished wood and cleverly interlocking gears, with two large wheels that he propelled with a hand crank. His face was open and bright, his eyes sparkling with an intelligence that was immediately disarming. You're Aang, right? The air nomad? Teo asked, rolling his chair closer until he was side by side with Aang at the railing. Aang just nodded, not trusting his voice. He expected pity, or more explanations, more justifications for the invasion of his past. But Teo didn't offer any. He just followed Aang's gaze out to the horizon. It's the best view in the whole world, isn't it? He said, his voice full of genuine awe. I never get tired of it. Sometimes I think I can see all the way to the spirit world from here. Something in his tone, a shared sense of wonder, made the hard knot in Aang's chest loosen just a fraction. Yeah, Aang managed, his voice rough. It is. My dad says your people built this place to be close to the sky, Teo continued, not looking at Aang, as if speaking to the mountains themselves. That they loved the freedom of it more than anything. I think I understand that. That got Aang's full attention. He turned to look at Teo, really look at him. He wasn't seeing a symbol of the desecration anymore. He was just seeing a boy, a few years younger than him, who talked about the sky with the same reverence Aang felt in his own soul. How? Aang asked, the simple word loaded with a century of loneliness. Teo finally turned to him, a brilliant, excited grin spreading across his face. It was a grin that could light up a room. I'll show you. With a practiced flick of his wrist, Teo unlocked a mechanism on his chair. He reached down and pulled out a compact, wooden and canvas object. With a series of swift, confident movements, he unfolded it, and it blossomed into a beautiful, expertly crafted glider. It wasn't like Aang's, it had a more rigid frame, a slightly different wing shape, evidence of its human, rather than Airbender, origins. But the spirit of it was the same. My dad built it for me, Teo said, his voice bursting with pride. Based on the old designs we found carved on the walls. He figured out how to make them work for anyone. The unspoken words hung between them. For someone who can't walk. For someone who can't airbend. You fly? Aang whispered, the concept so beautiful and so painful it almost hurt. It's the only time I feel truly free, Teo said, and the honesty in his voice was like a key turning in a rusty lock inside Aang's heart. Up there, it doesn't matter that my legs don't work like everyone else's. The wind doesn't care. It treats everyone the same. It's just you and the clouds and the whole world spread out beneath you like a map. It's the best feeling in the world. Aang looked from Teo's hopeful, shining face to the glider in his hands. This wasn't a defilement. This was a tribute. A desperate, brilliant, human attempt to reach for the same beauty his people had lived and died for. The anger that had been boiling inside him began to cool, replaced by a confused, aching sense of connection. I know the feeling, Aang said, and for the first time since landing, he felt a genuine smile touch his own lips. It was small, and it was sad, but it was real. Will you fly with me? Teo asked, his eyes wide with hopeful excitement. I've only ever flown with the others. I've never flown with a real air nomad. How could he say no? This boy, who understood the sacredness of the sky better than any of the adults shuffling through the temple below, was offering him a piece of his home back. Not the stones and the walls, but the feeling. The freedom. Yeah, Aang said, his voice stronger now. Yeah, I'd like that. A few minutes later, they stood at the very edge of the launching platform, the one Aang had used 100 times in his past life. The wind tugged at their clothes, a playful, familiar greeting. Teo was strapped securely into his glider, his hands gripping the control bars, his body thrumming with anticipation. Ready? Aang asked, unfolding his own glider staff. The white wings caught the sun, glowing. Always! Teo laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Together, they ran forward and leaped off the edge of the world. The air rushed up to meet them, a roaring, welcoming embrace. For a terrifying second, Teo's glider dipped, but then the wind caught its wings and he soared, whooping with exhilaration. Aang fell into a familiar dive, then swept up alongside him, the airbender and the boy in the machine, two spirits dancing in the same element. This is amazing! Teo shouted over the wind, his face split by a grin so wide it looked like it might hurt. You're so graceful. It's like you're not even flying, you're just talking to the air. Aang laughed, the last of his anger washing away in the sheer, physical joy of flight. He twisted into a spiral, then shot upwards on a thermal, the G-forces pulling at his skin. Teo followed, his movements more mechanical, but no less determined, no less filled with wonder. For what felt like an eternity, they were the only two people in existence. They raced through canyons, skimmed the tops of pine forests, and soared so high the temple below looked like a toy. Aang showed in tricks, how to read the subtle shifts in the wind, how to use the currents to gain speed without a single beat of his wings. Teo watched, absorbed every lesson, his mind as agile in the air as his father's machines were on the ground. Finally, they landed, breathless and laughing, on a wide, flat spire of rock far from the main temple. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound their panting breaths and the eternal sigh of the wind. Thank you, Teo said softly, his voice full of emotion. That was the best flight of my life. Aang looked at him, truly seeing him now. He wasn't an invader. He was a kindred spirit. A boy who had found a way to touch the sky despite the chains the world had put on him. In another life, he would have made a fantastic air nomad. The air nomads, Aang began, his gaze drifting back towards the altered temple, they believed that freedom was the most important thing in the world. That attachments to places and things just weighed you down. That true peace came from being able to go anywhere, to be a leaf on the wind. He paused, a old, familiar sadness returning, but it was clear now, less bitter. I was so angry when I saw what your people had done to the temple. I thought they'd destroyed that freedom. That they'd nailed the leaf to the ground. He looked back at Teo, his gray eyes clear. But you didn't, did you? You found your own way to be free. You didn't nail the leaf down. You built yourself a new one. Teo's eyes glistened. He understood the magnitude of what Aang was saying. It was a blessing. An absolution. It's still your home, Aang, Teo said earnestly. It will always be your home. We're just borrowing it. And we're trying to take care of it. I promise. Aang nodded, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a clean path through the dust on his cheek. It wasn't a tear of anger anymore. It was a tear of acceptance. Of grief for what was lost, but also of a fragile, newfound hope for what was found. The temple was different. His world was gone. But the sky was still here. The wind still sang the same songs. And in a boy named Teo, the spirit of the air nomads had found a new, unexpected, and beautiful voice. Chapter 80, The Tinkerer's Spark. While Aang's spirit was finding solace in the skies with Teo, a different kind of awakening was happening deep within the stone bowels of the temple. For Sokka, the initial shock of the temple's transformation had quickly given way to a buzzing, electric fascination. The sadness in Aang's eyes was a heavy thing, a cloak of gloom Sokka felt but didn't quite know how to lift. But here, amidst the clatter and hum of the mechanist's workshop, was a language he understood. It was a cavernous hall, once perhaps a place for silent meditation, now a cathedral of glorious, controlled chaos. The air thrummed with life, thick with the smells of hot metal, cutting oil, and sawdust. Sunlight streamed through high, arched windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust and glittering off half-finished inventions. Blueprints were pinned to every flat surface, scrawled with equations and sketches that made Sokka's fingers itch to hold a charcoal stick. This wasn't desecration. This was a symphony, and the mechanist was its conductor. Sokka watched, utterly captivated, as the older man moved from station to station, his hands, surprisingly deft and callous despite his scholarly appearance, adjusting a gear here, soldering a wire there. He wasn't just fixing things, he was conversing with them, listening to the whir of a pulley or the hiss of a steam valve as if it were whispering secrets. You see, young man, the mechanist said, not looking up from a complex assembly of interlocking brass rings, the principle is one of harmonic redistribution. The initial force, rather than being dissipated as wasteful kinetic energy, is captured and channeled back through the primary axle, thus increasing the overall torque without requiring a larger power source. Sokka stared, his mouth slightly agape. He understood maybe one word in three, but the concept was beautiful. So, you're making it smarter, he ventured, his voice full of awe. The mechanist finally looked up, peering over his spectacles. A genuine smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. Precisely. An elegantly put simplification. Smarter. I like that. Most people's eyes just glaze over. Glaze over? How could they? Sokka breathed, stepping closer to get a better look. This is incredible. Back in the Southern Water Tribe, the most complex thing we have is a toggle harpoon. And my watchtower. I built a watchtower. It leans a little. But it has a great view. The mechanist chuckled, a warm, rumbling sound. A fellow builder. I thought I sensed a kindred spirit. It's in the hands. You have the hands of a problem solver. He gestured to a workbench littered with tools. Don't just stand there. If you see a spanner that looks lonely, give it a purpose. That was all the invitation Sokka needed. For the next few hours, he was in heaven. He wasn't Sokka, the guy who trailed after the Avatar and the Master Waterbender. He wasn't the non-bender. He was Sokka, the apprentice. He fetched tools, held components steady while the mechanist soldered, and even offered a few suggestions of his own, his Water Tribe practicality providing a fresh perspective on some of the designs. This intake valve, Sokka said, pointing to a schematic for a water-powered hammer. If you angled it more like a narwhal's tusk, see, the water would spiral in. It'd hit harder and use less pressure. The mechanist stared at the drawing, then at Sokka, his eyebrows climbing towards his hairline. A narwhal's tusk. By the spirits, that's brilliant. the laminar flow would indeed create a more focused impact. He clapped Sokka on the shoulder, a gesture that made the boy stand a full inch taller. You have a natural talent for this, my boy. This was it. This was what he was good at. Not magic, not spirituality, but this. The solid, satisfying clunk of a gear engaging. The logic of a lever. The pure, beautiful cause and effect of engineering. Their collaborative bubble was eventually popped by one of the mechanist's assistants, a young woman with soot-smudged cheeks and a worried frown. Sir? It's the ventilation system in the old scriptorium. The one we're converting into the new dormitory. The problem is back, and it's worse. The air in the lower level is, well, it's unbreathable. Makes you lightheaded and sick. We can't finish the repairs. The mechanist's cheerful demeanor evaporated, replaced by a look of profound frustration. He pinched the bridge of his nose. The dampers again. I've recalibrated them 3 times. The geometry of those old air shafts is a nightmare. They weren't designed for a sealed environment. Without even thinking, Sokka jumped in. Can I see? I'm great with nightmare geometry. The mechanist gave him a tired but appreciative smile. Your enthusiasm is a tonic, Sokka. Very well. Let's have a look. The old scriptorium was a multi-level chamber, now a chaotic mess of construction. The problem was immediately obvious even before they reached the lower level, a faint, acrid, sweetish smell that caught in the back of the throat. As they descended a makeshift wooden staircase, the smell intensified. A few workers were coughing, handkerchiefs held over their faces. See, the assistant said, gesturing to a grill in the floor from which a barely visible, shimmering haze was emanating. We think it's a buildup of fumes from a natural geothermal vent deep below. The original air nomad design must have vented it straight out, but when we sealed the room for insulation, it started pooling. The mechanist knelt, peering at the grill and then at a series of complex lever and pulley systems connected to ducts high on the wall. He muttered to himself, tracing lines in the dust. The counterweight is wrong, the primary damper is sticking. If I reverse the polarity of the airflow, no, that would just pull more fumes in from the secondary shaft. Sokka didn't understand the specifics, but he understood the problem. It was a flow issue. Like a blocked water channel. He ignored the complex levers for a moment and just looked. He looked at the grill. He looked at the vents high on the wall. He looked at the room itself. The air nomads love the wind, right? Sokka said, thinking out loud. Indeed, the mechanist murmured, still absorbed in his calculations. Drafts were a feature, not a flaw. So they wouldn't have fought the air. They would have worked with it. Sokka's eyes scanned the room again, and then he saw it. High up, almost hidden in the shadows of the vaulted ceiling, was a narrow, horizontal slit in the outer wall, a deliberate architectural feature he'd seen all over the temple. A wind scoop. Wait a minute, Sokka said, his voice rising with excitement. What if you're trying to solve the wrong problem? The mechanist looked up, intrigued. How so? You're trying to force the bad air out with these big dampers, right? But it's a losing battle. What if you didn't fight it at all? Sokka pointed up at the wind scoop. What if you just gave the good air a reason to come in? He grabbed a piece of charcoal and a scrap of parchment from a nearby bench. He didn't draw complex gears. He drew 2 arrows. Look, he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. The bad, heavy air is sinking down here from this hole. Instead of trying to suck it all the way up to the ceiling to get it out, what if we just create a cross-draft? We use that wind scoop. We design a simple baffle, like a sail, to catch the wind outside and funnel it in right at the ceiling level. The fresh, cool air comes in high, it sinks, and as it sinks, it pushes the lighter, bad air along the floor, right back out through a vent we make low on the opposite wall. We don't need to pump it. We just let the wind do the work for us. We use the temple's own design against the problem. He finished, breathless, his heart pounding. He looked at the mechanist, half expecting to be laughed at for his simplistic, backwater idea. The mechanist was not laughing. He was staring at the crude drawing, his mouth open. He slowly took off his spectacles and polished them on his apron, a gesture of pure, stunned astonishment. By the great spirits of invention, he whispered. He looked from the drawing to the wind scoop, to the grill, and back to Sokka. The frustration on his face had melted away, replaced by a look of dawning, radiant epiphany. Sokka, he said, his voice filled with a new, profound respect. That is not just a solution. That is poetry. It's elegant. It's simple. It's perfect. He clapped his hands together, the sound echoing in the fume-choked room. We don't need to overpower the problem. We outsmart it. We use the enemy's own strength against them. It's sheer genius. Sokka beamed, a flush of pure, unadulterated pride warming him from the inside out. The assistant was already shouting orders, directing workers to start cutting the new vent. The problem that had stumped the brilliant mechanist for weeks was being solved because of his idea. In that moment, surrounded by the clatter of a new project beginning, with the respect of a true master shining in the older man's eyes, Sokka felt a sense of purpose so solid and real he could almost hold it in his hands. He had found his element. And it wasn't water, or earth, or fire. It was the spark of an idea, and the sheer, stubborn joy of building something that worked. That's the end of this tale for now. We've caught up to the story. The next installment will come soon. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in part 9. Peace.